The deepest parts of what makes you human, the need to love, to attach, to belong, have never been yours alone. They have been studied, mapped, and weaponized for longer than you know. This is the Human Bonding Iceberg. The 4 attachment styles is one of those concepts that has been turned into a pastel-colored Instagram infographic so many times that most people assume they already understand it. They don't. The actual science behind it is considerably more interesting than anything that fits in a square post. The framework was built by 2 researchers working decades apart. John Bowlby, a British psychiatrist working in the mid-20th century, was the first to propose that the bond between an infant and its caregiver wasn't just about food and comfort. It was a biological survival system. Babies who stayed close to caregivers lived longer. Attachment, in Bowlby's view, was evolution doing its job. Then came Mary Ainsworth, an American-Canadian psychologist who gave the theory its teeth through a deceptively simple experiment called the strange situation. She would place a toddler in an unfamiliar room with their caregiver, then have the caregiver briefly leave and return. The child's reaction to both the separation and the reunion revealed something remarkably consistent about how they related to the world. From this, 3 original patterns emerged, and a 4th was added later by researchers Mary Main and Judith Solomon. Secure attachment describes children, and later adults, who treat their caregiver as a reliable base. They explore freely, get upset when separated, and recover quickly when reunited. In adulthood, securely attached people tend to be comfortable with intimacy without becoming consumed by it. Anxious attachment, sometimes called anxious preoccupied, describes people whose caregivers were inconsistent, present and warm sometimes, distracted or unavailable other times. The child never quite knew what to expect, so they learned to amplify their distress signals to guarantee a response. In adults, this often looks like hypervigilance in relationships, reading too much into a delayed text, needing frequent reassurance, and struggling to self-soothe when something feels uncertain. Avoidant attachment, also called dismissive avoidant, develops when caregivers consistently minimize or dismiss emotional needs. The child learns that expressing distress doesn't work, so they suppress it entirely. These individuals often present as fiercely self-sufficient. They're not cold by nature. Their nervous systems learned that needing people was a losing strategy. The 4th style, fearful avoidant attachment, sometimes called disorganized, is the most complex of the group. It typically develops in environments where the caregiver was also a source of fear, through unpredictability, emotional volatility, or outright harm. The child is caught in an impossible bind. The person they need for safety is also the source of danger. There's no coherent strategy to resolve that, so none forms. In adulthood, fearful avoidant individuals often desperately want closeness while simultaneously pushing it away, not from indecision, but because intimacy has been wired to feel threatening at a biological level. The reason this framework matters beyond pop psychology is that attachment styles have been shown to influence everything from conflict resolution patterns to physical health outcomes. A 2019 study found that anxious attachment was associated with elevated cortisol levels, meaning the stress response isn't just psychological, it's measurable in the blood. Crucially, Bowlby and Ainsworth never intended these styles to be rigid life sentences. The research consistently shows they can shift through stable relationships, therapy, or even a single significant connection with a secure individual. The infographic version tends to leave that part out.
Like this video and subscribe to Maker.
Love languages is one of the most commercially successful psychological frameworks ever produced by a pastor with no formal research background, which tells you something interesting right from the start. Gary Chapman introduced the concept in his 1992 book, The 5 Love Languages, written primarily for Christian married couples experiencing emotional disconnection. The core idea is straightforward. People express and receive love in fundamentally different ways, and when 2 people in a relationship are operating on different frequencies, One or both of them will consistently feel unloved even when their partner genuinely believes they're doing everything right. The 5 languages Chapman identified are words of affirmation, verbal expressions of appreciation and encouragement, acts of service, doing things for someone to ease their load, receiving gifts, not materialism, but the symbolic weight of a thoughtful gesture, quality time, undivided, focused presence, and physical touch, not exclusively romantic contact, but the full range of physical connection, including a hand on the shoulder, or a hug that lingers a second longer than expected. Chapman arrived at these categories not through controlled studies or peer review, but by reviewing years of his own marriage counseling notes and identifying recurring patterns in what people said they were missing from their partners. That origin is worth sitting with. The framework became a cultural phenomenon, eventually selling over 20 million copies and spawning an entire industry of quizzes, workbooks, corporate seminars, and children's editions. At some point, a framework designed to help struggling married adults navigate emotional disconnection became something people put in their dating app bios. The misuse runs deeper than just overexposure. One consistent problem is that people treat their love language as a fixed identity, rather than a set of flexible preferences that shift depending on context, stress levels, and the specific relationship. Someone who craves words of affirmation from a romantic partner might barely register them from a coworker. The quiz makes it feel like a personality type. The original book is more nuanced than that. The more pointed criticism comes from researchers. Psychologists like Dr. Welby Ingram and others who attempted to validate the framework found the 5 categories don't hold up cleanly under controlled conditions. People's preferences overlap significantly, and the idea that everyone has one dominant love language that unlocks their emotional needs is not well supported by the data. What the framework does do, and this is likely why it spread so effectively, is give people a vocabulary for a conversation that many couples had never found a way to start. Telling someone I feel disconnected from you is harder to act on than I need more quality time and less time on your phone while we're in the same room. Chapman's original insight, that people can love each other genuinely while still consistently missing each other, remains one of the more useful ideas in popular relationship literature. The problem is that somewhere between the book and the quiz and the branded merchandise, that nuance got smoothed out entirely. The honeymoon phase is a term most people use casually to describe the early period of a relationship when everything feels electric and your new partner seems incapable of doing anything wrong. The neurochemical reality behind that experience is considerably stranger than the greeting card version suggests. When a person falls in what we typically call in love, the brain enters a state that researchers have compared, with clinical seriousness, to addiction and to certain presentations of obsessive-compulsive disorder. That's not a metaphor. The brain activity observed in early romantic attachment overlaps meaningfully with both. The 3 key players are dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Dopamine, the brain's reward signaling chemical, floods the system in response to the new partner, creating the same craving and reward loop that reinforces other intensely pleasurable behaviors. Norepinephrine drives the elevated heart rate, the inability to sleep, the fact that you suddenly remember every detail of a conversation you had with this person 3 weeks ago. These two together produce the euphoric, slightly unhinged quality of early attraction. Then there's serotonin, and this is the part that tends to surprise people. Serotonin levels in the early stages of romantic love have been measured at significantly lower levels than normal. A 2004 study led by Dr. Donatella Maraziti at the University of Pisa found that newly in love individuals had serotonin levels comparable to patients diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder. That intrusive, looping quality of early love, where the other person keeps surfacing in your thoughts uninvited, isn't just poetry. It's a measurable neurological event. The phase typically lasts somewhere between 6 months and 2 years. The exact duration varies by person and circumstance, but the endpoint is consistent. The brain simply cannot sustain that level of chemical output indefinitely. It's expensive, neurologically speaking. When it ends, dopamine output normalizes. Norepinephrine settles. Serotonin returns to baseline. People often interpret this transition as the relationship losing its spark, or as evidence that they chose the wrong person. Relationship researchers call this the move from passionate love to companionate love, a calmer, more stable form of attachment that relies less on neurochemical flooding and more on the actual architecture of the relationship that was built during the euphoric period. The problem is that the honeymoon phase, by design, makes the relationship feel effortless. Everything clicks. Conflict is minimal. The other person's flaws either haven't appeared yet or get unconsciously filtered out. Then the chemistry normalizes, the filter lifts, and suddenly the relationship requires actual work, which it always did, but which the neurochemistry was conveniently obscuring. Dr. Helen Fisher, one of the leading researchers in the biology of love, has described the transition out of the honeymoon phase not as love dying, but as love changing form. The brain regions active in long-term attachment, particularly those tied to bonding and calm, are different from the regions lit up in early infatuation. It's a different neurological experience, not a lesser one. The cultural narrative around the honeymoon phase tends to treat its ending as a loss. The research suggests it's more accurately described as the point where you find out what you actually built. Codependency is a term that gets used so loosely in everyday conversation that it has almost lost its clinical weight entirely. Most people deploy it to mean something like too attached or clingy, a couple that spends every waking moment together, or a friend who can't make a decision without running it by someone else first. The actual definition is more specific and considerably more uncomfortable. The concept originated not in romantic relationship research, but in addiction recovery communities during the 1970s and 80s. Therapists and counselors working with people struggling with alcohol dependency began noticing a consistent pattern in their partners and family members, people who had organized their entire emotional lives around managing, enabling, or compensating for someone else's dysfunction. The term used at the time was co-alcoholic. Codependency was the broader version that emerged when clinicians recognized the pattern extended well beyond substance-related households. At its core, codependency describes a relationship dynamic where one person's sense of identity, self-worth, and emotional stability becomes so tied to another person's needs, moods, or approval that they effectively lose track of their own. It's not simply caring deeply about someone. It's a condition where the caretaking itself becomes the primary way a person relates to the world, where saying no feels dangerous, where another person's distress becomes your emergency, and where your own needs become so consistently deprioritized that you eventually stop noticing them. Melody Beattie's 1986 book Codependent No More brought the concept into mainstream awareness and remains one of the best-selling self-help books ever published. Beattie, who drew from her own experience in recovery communities, described codependency as a pattern that could exist in any relationship, romantic, familial, professional, wherever one person had learned that their value came from being needed. The reason it surfaces at this level of the iceberg rather than deeper is that the surface definition is genuinely useful as a starting point. The word carries real information when used correctly. The layers underneath it, where the pattern comes from, how it operates in more subtle and unexpected contexts, and why it can be so difficult to recognize from the inside, are a different conversation. One we'll be returning to. Jealousy is one of the few emotions that almost everyone experiences, almost everyone condemns, and almost no one fully understands, including the people feeling it in the moment. From an evolutionary psychology standpoint, jealousy is not a flaw in human emotional wiring. It's a feature. Researchers in the field, most notably Dr. David Buss of the University of Texas, have spent decades documenting jealousy as an adaptive mechanism, an emotional alarm system that evolved specifically to protect valuable social bonds from interference. In environments where losing a mate or a key ally could have serious consequences for survival and reproduction, individuals who felt nothing when those bonds were threatened tended to do worse. Jealousy, uncomfortable as it is, kept people paying attention. Buss's research also produced one of the more debated findings in evolutionary psychology: the idea that men and women experience jealousy differently on average and in predictable directions. Men, the theory goes, show heightened responses to sexual infidelity. Women show stronger responses to emotional infidelity. The proposed explanation is rooted in the different reproductive pressures each faced historically. But this finding has been contested, replicated, challenged, and re-replicated enough times that it remains genuinely unresolved. Possessiveness is where the picture gets more complicated. Jealousy is an emotional response to a perceived threat. Possessiveness is the behavioral pattern that can grow out of it, the impulse to control, monitor, or restrict a partner in order to eliminate the source of that threat. One is involuntary, the other is a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. The distinction matters because possessive behavior is frequently presented, and genuinely experienced, as evidence of love rather than control. The logic runs something like, I act this way because I care so much. Evolutionary psychology can explain where the underlying impulse comes from. It does not excuse what people do with it. At this level, jealousy and possessiveness are relatively familiar territory. Most people have experienced one or both in some form, and most have a working sense of where the line between normal and unhealthy sits. The entries further down will examine what happens when that line disappears entirely. The strange situation experiment is one of those studies that sounds almost mundane on paper, and turns out to be one of the most revealing psychological procedures ever designed. Mary Ainsworth ran it at Johns Hopkins University in the early 1970s. The setup was simple by design. A mother and her toddler, typically between 12 and 18 months old, were brought into an unfamiliar laboratory room stocked with toys. Then, over the course of roughly 20 minutes, a structured sequence of events unfolded in 8 distinct episodes, each lasting about 3 minutes. First, the mother and child were left alone to settle. Then a stranger entered the room. Then the mother quietly left, leaving the child with the stranger. Then the mother returned. Then the mother left again, this time leaving the child completely alone. Then the stranger returned. And finally, the mother came back once more. The researchers weren't especially interested in how the children behaved when their mothers left. Separation distress in toddlers is common and not particularly diagnostic on its own. Ainsworth was watching something more specific: how the children behaved when their mothers came back. That reunion behavior turned out to be extraordinarily telling. Securely attached children would typically show distress during separation, but upon reunion, they'd move toward their mother, seek comfort, receive it, and then return to playing. The caregiver worked. The child used her as intended, as a safe base to return to and recover from. Anxiously attached children were far more difficult to soothe. They'd cling during reunion, resist being put down, but also push away, or continue crying even while being held. They were simultaneously seeking comfort and rejecting it, stuck in a loop that the reunion itself couldn't resolve. Avoidantly attached children did something that struck observers as almost eerie. They appeared not to care. When their mother returned, they'd continue playing, look away, or actively move in the opposite direction. They seemed unbothered, but physiological measurements told a different story entirely. Their cortisol levels and heart rates during separation were just as elevated as the distressed children. They had learned to suppress the outward expression of need without actually eliminating the internal experience of it. The fourth pattern, disorganized attachment, wasn't formally classified until Main and Solomon analyzed existing strange situation footage in the late 1980s and noticed a subset of children who fit none of the above categories. These children showed contradictory, fragmented behavior during reunion, approaching and then freezing mid-motion, turning in circles, falling to the floor without apparent cause, briefly dissociating from the environment entirely. The behavior had no coherent strategy because, as we covered earlier, no coherent strategy was available to them. The experiment has been replicated hundreds of times across dozens of countries, and the core patterns hold with remarkable consistency across cultures, though the proportions of each style vary. In some northern European countries, avoidant attachment rates are higher, likely reflecting cultural norms around independence and emotional expression. In some East Asian contexts, anxious attachment is more common. One detail worth sitting with: every child in the strange situation was separated from their caregiver for a total of only a few minutes in an otherwise safe environment. The differences in reunion behavior weren't produced by the experiment. They were already there, encoded by the first year or so of the child's life, simply waiting for the right conditions to become visible. Ainsworth had designed a window, not a test, and what she saw through it changed the direction of developmental psychology entirely. Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis is one of those foundational scientific claims that was influential enough to reshape government policy across multiple countries, and controversial enough that researchers have been arguing about it ever since. John Bowlby put forward the hypothesis in 1951, in a report commissioned by the World Health Organization. The core claim was stark: if a child is separated from its mother, or a consistent maternal figure, during a critical window in early development, roughly the first 2 years of life, the psychological damage that results is permanent. Not difficult to recover from. Permanent. Bowlby drew heavily on two sources to make this case. The first was his own clinical work with juvenile delinquents in London during the 1940s, where he documented a study of 44 young thieves and found that a significant portion of them had experienced early and prolonged separation from their mothers. The second was research by fellow psychologist Renee Spitz, who had observed infants in institutional care, orphanages and foundling homes, where children received adequate physical care but almost no individual emotional attention. Those children showed severe developmental delays, emotional withdrawal, and in some cases declined so rapidly they did not survive. Spitz called the condition hospitalism. The hypothesis landed hard. It directly influenced childcare policy in Britain and the United States, contributing to changes in how hospitals handled young patients. Prior to Bowlby's influence, parental visiting in children's wards was often heavily restricted on the assumption it caused unnecessary distress. His work helped dismantle that practice. It also, less helpfully, fed a cultural narrative that placed the entire weight of a child's psychological future squarely on the mother's continuous physical presence, a framing that had significant implications for working mothers, and that critics, particularly feminist scholars, argued was used to push women back into the home in the post-war period. The scientific challenges came from multiple directions. Psychologist Michael Rudder published a detailed re-examination in 1972 called Maternal Deprivation Reassessed, which remains one of the more important critiques in developmental psychology. Rudder argued that Bowlby had conflated several distinct experiences under a single label. Separation from the mother was not the same as deprivation of attachment. Deprivation of attachment was not the same as having an attachment that was later disrupted. And the idea that the mother specifically was irreplaceable, as opposed to any consistent, responsive caregiver, was not supported by the evidence. Rudder also pushed back on the irreversibility claim. Studies of children who had experienced severe early deprivation but were later placed in nurturing environments showed meaningful recovery, not always complete, but substantial enough to challenge the idea that the damage was sealed in permanently. The longer-term picture is complicated. Bowlby was right that early attachment experiences matter enormously, and right that institutional neglect produces serious harm. He was almost certainly overstating the case on irreversibility, and the mother-specific framing has not held up cleanly. What the hypothesis did, even in its flawed form, was force an entire field to take early emotional experience seriously as a developmental variable. At a time when dominant thinking, shaped heavily by behaviorism, treated infant emotional needs as largely irrelevant to long-term outcomes. The overcorrection produced its own distortions, but the underlying direction Bowlby was pointing was not wrong. Proximity seeking is the technical term for something every person on Earth has done without knowing it had a name. The drive to move physically closer to a caregiver, a partner, or a trusted person when threatened, stressed, or frightened. The evolutionary argument built around it reframes everything we've covered so far in a way that some people find clarifying and others find quietly unsettling. The argument is this: attachment is not, at its root, an emotional phenomenon. It is a biological survival mechanism. The emotional experience, the warmth, the longing, the distress of separation, is the delivery system. The actual function is keeping vulnerable organisms alive by keeping them near protection. Bowlby arrived at this framing partly through ethology, the study of animal behavior in natural environments. He was particularly influenced by the work of Konrad Lorenz, who documented imprinting in geese, the process by which newborn animals instinctively bond to the first moving figure they encounter, following it closely regardless of whether that figure is their biological parent, a different animal, or in Lorenz's famous demonstrations, a human researcher in rubber boots walking across a field. The geese were not feeling affection. They were running a survival program. Bowlby proposed that human infants operate on a similar system, though considerably more sophisticated. The infant arrives with a set of pre-installed behaviors: crying, clinging, reaching, making eye contact, smiling, each of which functions as a signal designed to pull caregivers closer. These aren't learned. They're present from birth, and they exist because infants who successfully triggered caregiving behavior in the adults around them were the ones who survived long enough to eventually become adults themselves. The critical insight is that the attachment system is threat-activated. When an infant feels safe and calm, the exploratory system takes over. They're curious, engaged, willing to move away from the caregiver to investigate the environment. When threat is detected, whether that's a loud noise, an unfamiliar face, hunger, or simply the caregiver moving out of sight, the attachment system switches on and proximity seeking begins. Safety restores the balance. Exploration resumes. This on-off dynamic, which researchers call the secure base effect, has been observed consistently across human cultures and across dozens of other species. It appears to be one of the more conserved features of mammalian social behavior, meaning evolution kept it because it kept working. The implication that tends to catch people off guard is what this means for adult relationships. The same threat-activated proximity seeking that governed infant behavior doesn't simply switch off at adulthood. It shifts targets. Romantic partners, close friends, and trusted family members take on the role of attachment figures, and under sufficient stress, the same system activates. Adults under threat move toward their attachment figures, seek reassurance, and show measurable distress when that reassurance is unavailable. The person who insists they don't need anyone and the person who falls apart when their partner doesn't answer a call are running the same underlying program. The difference is in what their early environment taught that program to expect. Framing attachment as a survival mechanism rather than a purely emotional one doesn't make it less meaningful. It makes it harder to dismiss. Internal working models is Bowlby's answer to a question that attachment research kept running into. If attachment patterns form in infancy, what exactly is the mechanism that carries them forward into adult life? The answer he proposed is one of the more consequential ideas in the entire field. The concept works like this. As an infant accumulates experiences with its caregivers, repeated interactions over weeks and months, the brain begins extracting patterns from those experiences and building mental representations based on them. Not memories in the conscious sense, but something more structural. Templates, default assumptions about how relationships work, what other people can be expected to do, and what the self is worth in relation to others. A child whose caregiving environment was consistently warm and responsive builds an internal working model that encodes, roughly, other people are available when I need them, I am worthy of care, and relationships are generally safe. A child whose environment was unpredictable builds a model that encodes, other people cannot be relied upon, my needs may or may not be met, and vigilance is the appropriate default setting. A child raised in an environment of consistent emotional dismissal builds a model that encodes, needing people is a liability, self-sufficiency is the only reliable strategy. None of this happens consciously. The child is not drawing conclusions. The brain is simply doing what brains do, finding patterns in repeated experience and converting them into operating assumptions that can be applied automatically, without the cost of evaluating each new situation from scratch. The reason Bowlby called them working models is significant. They are not static records. They are active, generative structures that the brain uses to anticipate, interpret, and respond to new relational experiences. When you meet someone new, your internal working model is already making predictions before the other person has done anything worth predicting from. It is filling in gaps, assigning likely intentions, and preparing emotional responses based on what it learned worked or didn't work in a completely different relationship with a completely different person decades earlier. This is the mechanism behind attachment pattern repetition. It is not habit in the simple sense. It is the brain running its most fundamental relational software on every close relationship it encounters, because that software was built to be universal. A set of rules about people in general, extracted from experiences with the first people ever encountered. The clinical implications of this are significant. Therapists working with attachment-related difficulties spend considerable time helping people make their internal working models visible, because a model you can examine consciously is one you can begin to revise. The brain built these templates through experience, and experience is also what can update them. It is slow work, and it requires the right conditions, but Bowlby was explicit that internal working models, while stable and persistent, are not sealed permanently at age 2. The most disorienting aspect of the concept is not that these models exist. It is how invisible they are from the inside. People operating from an insecure internal working model don't experience themselves as running outdated relational software. They experience themselves as accurately reading the situation in front of them. The model feels like perception. That's precisely what makes it so difficult to catch. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain most directly responsible for the qualities we associate with mature, regulated human behavior: planning, impulse control, emotional modulation, the ability to pause before reacting. It sits at the front of the brain, just behind the forehead, and it is the last region of the brain to fully develop. In humans, that process isn't complete until the mid-20s, which explains a considerable amount about adolescent behavior without requiring any further elaboration. Its role in attachment is specific and important. When the attachment system activates, when threat is detected and proximity seeking begins, the prefrontal cortex is the structure responsible for regulating how that response plays out. It receives the alarm signal, weighs it against available information, and modulates the output. It's the part of the brain that can take an anxious impulse and run it through a filter before it becomes anxious behavior. Under normal conditions, in a well-regulated nervous system, this process is largely invisible. The alarm sounds, the prefrontal cortex does its job, and the response is proportionate to the actual situation. The person can feel distress without being consumed by it, can communicate a need without it arriving as a crisis, and can tolerate temporary uncertainty in a relationship without the attachment system escalating to a full emergency. The problem is what happens to this system under sustained stress, and more significantly, under early trauma. The key structure working alongside the prefrontal cortex here is the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. Under normal conditions, the prefrontal cortex maintains a degree of regulatory control over amygdala output, essentially acting as a moderating voice on the alarm system. Under acute stress, that relationship inverts. The amygdala effectively takes the wheel. Prefrontal function is suppressed. Responses become faster, more reflexive, and less calibrated to the actual details of the situation. This is adaptive in genuine emergencies. It is significantly less useful during an argument with a partner about whose turn it is to do the dishes. The more serious complication involves chronic early stress and trauma. Research by neuroscientists including Dr. Martin Teicher at Harvard has shown that sustained adversity during childhood, consistent unpredictability, threat, or emotional unavailability in the caregiving environment produces measurable structural changes in the developing brain. The prefrontal cortex in individuals who experienced early chronic stress tends to show reduced volume and reduced connectivity with the regions it's supposed to regulate. The amygdala, conversely, tends to be more reactive. This creates a neurological landscape in which the emotional alarm system is more sensitive and the regulatory infrastructure is less equipped to manage it. That combination shows up in adult relationships as what looks like emotional dysregulation, responses that seem disproportionate to outside observers, difficulty returning to baseline after conflict, and a nervous system that interprets ambiguous relational signals as threatening, because it was built in an environment where ambiguous signals usually were. The bridge this builds between the internal working models discussed earlier and actual observable behavior is direct. The templates Bowlby described are not purely psychological abstractions. They are encoded in neural architecture. The expectations built in early life don't just shape how a person thinks about relationships, they shape the physical structure of the brain doing the thinking. That's not a metaphor, it's an MRI finding. Earned secure attachment is one of the more genuinely hopeful findings in attachment research, and one of the more frequently oversimplified ones. The distinction it draws from is subtle but important. Researchers studying adult attachment, particularly through a tool called the Adult Attachment Interview developed by Mary Main, began noticing that not everyone who presented as securely attached had experienced consistently secure early childhoods. Some had difficult, neglectful, or chaotic early histories, and yet, by adulthood, they showed all the markers of secure attachment. They could reflect coherently on their early experiences, acknowledge their impact without being destabilized by them, and engage in close relationships without the defensive patterns typical of insecure attachment. These individuals were classified as earned secure, as opposed to continuous secure, meaning people whose security traced back uninterrupted to early caregiving. The fact that the two groups were functionally indistinguishable on most outcome measures was significant. It confirmed that the attachment system retains meaningful plasticity well beyond childhood. The mechanisms behind earned security, however, are considerably more specific than the broader therapy culture tends to acknowledge. The adult attachment interview findings suggested that the most consistent pathway to earned security ran through what researchers call narrative coherence, the ability to construct a clear, honest, and emotionally integrated account of one's own history. Not a sanitized version, not a story of triumph over adversity, a coherent one. People who could acknowledge painful early experiences, reflect on how those experiences affected them, and hold complexity without either dismissing the past or being overwhelmed by it, those people tended to show earned security. What this means is that the mechanism is not simply having good experiences later in life. It's the processing of earlier experiences in a way that integrates them into a coherent self-understanding. Positive later relationships are a significant contributor. A stable romantic partner, a responsive therapist, or even a single reliable mentor figure can provide the kind of corrective relational experience that gradually updates the internal working model. But the relationship alone, without the reflective work, is less reliably transformative than therapy culture often implies. Dr. Mary Main's collaborator, Eric Hesse, described the adult attachment interview as a measure of coherence of mind with respect to attachment, meaning the interview wasn't primarily assessing what happened to someone, but how they had come to organize and make sense of what happened to them. This has a specific clinical implication that is worth stating plainly. Two people can have nearly identical difficult histories and arrive at very different attachment outcomes in adulthood, not because one suffered more than the other, but because of differences in how much reflective processing they were able to do and what relational resources were available to support that processing. The research on earned security also pushed back against a quieter assumption embedded in early attachment theory: the idea that secure attachment in adulthood required secure attachment in childhood. Bowlby himself leaned toward that view. The earned secure findings complicated it considerably. The outcome is not guaranteed, and the pathway is not linear. But the data is consistent enough to say with confidence that early insecurity is not a fixed destination. It is a starting point that some people, under the right conditions, demonstrably move away from. Disorganized attachment in adults is the attachment style that receives the least clean explanation in popular psychology, partly because it resists the tidy summaries that work reasonably well for the other three, and partly because its presentation in adult relationships is genuinely more complex and variable than anything a short infographic can capture. To briefly reorient, disorganized attachment in infancy, as covered when we examined the strange situation, emerges when the caregiver is simultaneously the source of safety and the source of fear. The child needs to move toward the caregiver and away from them at the same time. That contradiction has no resolution, so no coherent behavioral strategy forms. In infancy, this shows up as fragmented, contradictory behavior. In adulthood, the same fundamental dynamic appears, but it has had years to develop considerably more sophisticated and painful expressions. The adult presentation of disorganized attachment is typically classified as fearful avoidant. The defining feature is not simply a fear of intimacy or a desire for it. It is the simultaneous presence of both, at full intensity, at the same time. The person genuinely wants closeness. The person also experiences closeness as dangerous. These two states do not take turns. They coexist, and the result is a relational pattern that can look chaotic, contradictory, or baffling from the outside, and feels exactly that way from the inside. In practice, this tends to produce what clinicians describe as a push-pull dynamic. The person moves toward connection, and as that connection deepens, something activates that drives them away, not as a conscious strategy, but as a nervous system response. Then the distance becomes intolerable, and the pull toward connection returns. Partners on the receiving end of this cycle frequently describe it as emotional whiplash. The fearful avoidant person frequently describes it as being at war with themselves. One of the more clinically significant features is the presence of dissociation during intimacy. In individuals with disorganized attachment, particularly those with trauma histories, close physical or emotional contact can trigger a partial disconnection from present experience, a numbing, a sense of unreality, or a sudden emotional absence that neither the person nor their partner can easily explain. This is not deliberate withdrawal. It is the nervous system doing what it learned to do when closeness became threatening, removing itself from an experience it has categorized as dangerous, regardless of whether the current situation actually warrants that response. The overlap between disorganized attachment and trauma histories is not coincidental. Research consistently shows this attachment style is significantly overrepresented among survivors of childhood abuse, neglect, and chronic household instability. Dr. Mary Main's original observations and subsequent work by researchers, including Dr. Giovanni Liotti, established that the disorganized pattern is specifically linked to experiences where the attachment figure was frightening, not simply absent or inconsistent, but actively a source of alarm. Liotti extended this further, proposing that the irresolvable conflict at the core of disorganized attachment, needing the person you fear, creates a structural vulnerability to dissociation that can persist into adulthood and reactivate under relational stress. In relationships, fearful avoidant individuals often present with a specific and painful combination: a deep capacity for emotional insight, a genuine longing for stable connection, and a nervous system that has been calibrated to expect that connection will eventually become threatening. They frequently understand their own patterns with considerable clarity. Understanding them and interrupting them in real time are two entirely different problems. The distinction from avoidant attachment is worth drawing clearly, because the surface behavior can sometimes look similar. The dismissive avoidant person has a relatively stable, if limited, relationship with their own emotional needs. They've suppressed them, but consistently. The fearful avoidant person has no such stability. The needs are fully present and fully in conflict. The resulting internal experience is considerably more volatile. Treatment approaches that have shown the most consistent results with this attachment style tend to involve trauma-focused work alongside relational repair, specifically therapeutic relationships, stable and consistent enough to provide repeated evidence that intimacy does not inevitably become dangerous. That process is slow, and it requires a therapeutic relationship that can itself withstand the push-pull dynamic without collapsing or retaliating, which is, by any measure, a significant ask. But it happens, and when it does, the changes tend to be among the most meaningful in the clinical literature. The still face experiment is one of the most emotionally affecting pieces of footage in the psychological research archive. It is also one of the most efficient demonstrations ever designed of how dependent the infant nervous system is on responsive human contact. Edward Tronick ran the original version at Harvard in 1975. The setup required almost nothing in the way of equipment or elaborate procedure. A mother and her infant, typically between 2 and 6 months old, sat facing each other and interacted normally. The mother smiled, made sounds, mirrored the baby's expressions, responded in real time to every cue the infant produced. Standard caregiving behavior. The infant was visibly engaged, animated, and regulated. Then Tronic instructed the mother to go still. No expression, no response, nothing. The mother's face became a blank, and she held it there regardless of what the infant did. What follows, in the filmed recordings, unfolds in a sequence that is difficult to watch even knowing it's a controlled experiment with a brief duration and a benign outcome. The infant initially attempts to re-engage the mother using the exact tools that had always worked before: smiling, pointing, vocalizing, making eye contact, and then looking away in the standard rhythm of back-and-forth interaction. Each of these bids goes unanswered. The mother's face remains empty. Within seconds, not minutes, seconds, the infant's behavior begins to shift. The attempts to re-engage become more effortful and more urgent. Then, as the unresponsiveness continues, something else happens. The infant begins to withdraw. Posture collapses. Gaze averts. The animated engagement of moments earlier gives way to visible distress, and then to something that researchers describe as a kind of shutdown. Some infants cry, others go quiet in a way that is its own form of alarm. When the mother resumes normal interaction, most infants recover, but not immediately. There is a lag, a period of wariness, of testing, of re-establishing that the responsiveness is real and reliable before the infant fully returns to baseline. Tronic documented that even after reunion, some infants continued showing residual dysregulation for a period after the experiment ended. The experiment demonstrated several things that now sit at the foundation of developmental psychology. First, that infants are not passive recipients of caregiving. They are active participants in a continuous real-time social exchange, and they are tracking the responsiveness of the other person in that exchange with extraordinary sensitivity. Second, that the breakdown of that responsiveness produces rapid and measurable psychological distress, not gradually, but almost immediately. Third, that the infant's regulatory system is not self-contained. It is co-regulatory by design. The caregiver's nervous system, expressed through face and voice and touch, is doing active work in stabilizing the infant's nervous system. Remove that input, and the infant's internal state begins to deteriorate. Tronic later described this as the foundation of what he called mutual regulation. The idea that early psychological development is not something that happens inside the infant in isolation, but something that happens between the infant and the caregiver in the space of their interaction. The still face condition isn't a simulation of neglect in the severe sense. It's a simulation of ordinary emotional unavailability, a caregiver who is physically present but not responding. The fact that even a few minutes of this produces measurable distress in a healthy infant with a loving mother gives some indication of what chronic emotional unavailability, repeated over months and years, does to the developing nervous system. The footage exists widely online. It remains one of those things that once seen tends to stay with people, not because it ends badly, but because of how quickly and completely it strips away any remaining doubt that emotional responsiveness is not a luxury in early development. It's the infrastructure. Attachment disruption and the immune system is where the conversation about bonding moves decisively out of the realm of psychology and into the body itself, and the findings are considerably more concrete than most people expect. The foundational claim is this: early attachment disruption doesn't only shape how a person thinks, feels, and relates to others. It leaves measurable biological signatures in the immune system that can be detected decades later. The psychological and the physiological in this context are not separate tracks. They are the same track. The research connecting early adversity to immune function has accumulated steadily since the 1990s, building on a broader field called psychoneuroimmunology, the study of how psychological states and nervous system activity interact with immune function. The basic architecture of that connection runs through the stress response system, specifically the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which governs the release of cortisol and related stress hormones. When that system is activated chronically in early life, as it is in environments characterized by threat, unpredictability, or emotional unavailability, it doesn't simply return to baseline once the environment improves. It calibrates. The stress response system adjusts its sensitivity thresholds based on early experience, operating under something close to an assumption that the level of threat encountered in infancy is the level of threat that will characterize the world going forward. The immune consequences of this calibration are specific. Research led by Dr. Michael Irwin at the University of California, Los Angeles, and parallel work by Dr. Sheldon Cohen at Carnegie Mellon demonstrated that individuals with histories of early adversity show elevated levels of systemic inflammation in adulthood, particularly elevated markers of a protein called interleukin-6 and a broader inflammatory signaling molecule called C-reactive protein. These are not trivial findings. Chronic low-grade inflammation of this kind is associated with increased risk for cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders, depression, and accelerated cellular aging. A landmark study published in 2011 in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examined telomere length, the protective caps on chromosomes that shorten with age and stress, in adults with documented histories of early adversity. The researchers found significantly shorter telomeres in that group compared to controls, suggesting that early attachment disruption was associated with measurable acceleration of biological aging at the cellular level. The work of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, summarized in his widely read book, The Body Keeps the Score, brought much of this research into mainstream awareness. Van der Kolk's central argument is that traumatic and adverse early experiences are stored not only in psychological patterns and neural architecture, but in the body's regulatory systems, and that the body continues to respond to those stored experiences long after the original circumstances have passed. The immune system findings give that argument a specific and measurable dimension. A person who experienced early attachment disruption isn't just carrying psychological patterns forward. They may be carrying a chronically upregulated inflammatory response, a stress system with a lower activation threshold, and cellular aging markers consistent with decades of low-grade physiological strain. The practical implication runs in two directions. On one hand, it underscores the seriousness of early relational adversity in a way that purely psychological framing sometimes fails to communicate. On the other hand, research on earned secure attachment and trauma-informed intervention has shown that some of these biological markers are responsive to change. Therapeutic approaches that successfully reduce psychological distress have been associated with measurable reductions in inflammatory markers in some studies, suggesting that the biological pathway, like the psychological one, retains at least partial plasticity. The body, it turns out, is paying attention to everything. It has been the entire time. Object constancy is a term borrowed from developmental psychology that describes a capacity most securely attached people exercise constantly without realizing it has a name, and whose absence, in people who lack it, shapes nearly every close relationship they have. The concept originates with the Swiss developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, who used object permanence to describe the milestone at which an infant understands that a physical object continues to exist even when it's out of sight. Before that milestone, objects that disappear simply cease to exist in the infant's experience. Object constancy is the emotional equivalent of that developmental step, applied not to objects, but to people. A person with solid object constancy carries a stable, integrated internal image of the people they're close to, an image that persists and remains accessible even during conflict, physical separation, or intense negative emotion. When you're furious at someone you love and can still access, somewhere underneath the anger, the knowledge that you love them, and that the relationship has value, that's object constancy doing its job. When a close friend doesn't respond to a message and you feel irritated rather than convinced the friendship is over. Same mechanism. The development of object constancy is tied directly to the quality of early caregiving. Margaret Mahler, the Hungarian-American psychoanalyst who did foundational work in this area during the 1960s and 70s, described it as one of the final and most fragile achievements of early psychological development, typically consolidating somewhere between ages 2 and 3, and requiring a caregiving environment that was consistent and reliable enough to build a stable internal representation from. When early caregiving was inconsistent, threatening, or emotionally unavailable, that consolidation is disrupted. The internal image of the caregiver never becomes stable. It remains split between a good version and a bad version that don't fully integrate. This is where the clinical concept of splitting originates, and it is closely associated with disorganized attachment and certain trauma-related presentations in adulthood. In practical terms, impaired object constancy means that conflict doesn't feel like a temporary disruption to an otherwise stable relationship. It feels like evidence that the relationship is fundamentally unsafe, or that the other person has transformed into someone different. The warm, loving version of the partner and the angry, disappointing version feel like two separate people rather than two states of the same person. When the negative state is active, the positive one becomes genuinely difficult to access, not as a rhetorical position, but as an actual failure of emotional retrieval. The consequences ripple through every dimension of close relationships. Separations feel more threatening than circumstances warrant. Reassurance provided during calm moments doesn't carry forward effectively into moments of conflict. Arguments that most couples experience as frustrating but manageable can land as existential, triggering levels of distress that seem disproportionate until you understand that the person's nervous system is not registering a temporary disagreement. It is registering what feels like the loss of the relationship itself. This also explains why verbal reassurance often fails to soothe people with impaired object constancy in the way the person offering it expects. Being told, "I still love you, I'm just angry right now," requires the listener to hold two emotional states in mind simultaneously. If the neural and psychological infrastructure for that integration isn't fully developed, the words land without sticking. Therapeutic work aimed at building object constancy tends to be slow and specifically relational in nature, because what the person needs, in essence, is repeated experience of someone remaining stable, available, and consistent across the full range of relational weather. The therapist's predictability across good sessions and difficult ones, across ruptures and repairs, is itself the intervention. It is one of the more quietly devastating gaps that early relational disruption can leave, precisely because it makes the ordinary texture of close relationships feel impossible to trust. Trauma bonding is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in all of relationship psychology, and the misunderstanding has real consequences because it shapes how abuse survivors are judged by the people around them, and more damagingly, how they judge themselves. The first thing to establish is what trauma bonding is not. It is not Stockholm Syndrome, which is a separate phenomenon involving hostages developing positive feelings toward captors during extended captivity under specific conditions. The two get conflated regularly, but they describe different mechanisms operating in different contexts. Trauma bonding occurs in ongoing intimate relationships, romantic partnerships, family dynamics, certain close friendships, and it is driven by a specific cycle rather than by the conditions of captivity. The clinical framework most associated with trauma bonding comes from psychologist Dr. Lenore Walker, who documented what she called the cycle of abuse in the late 1970s, and from Dr. Patrick Carnes, who later developed the trauma bonding concept specifically in the 1990s. The cycle they and subsequent researchers described moves through recognizable phases: a tension-building period, an incident of abusive behavior, a reconciliation phase involving apology, affection, or promises of change, and then a calm period before tension begins building again. The neurochemical dimension of this cycle is where the mechanism becomes genuinely difficult to escape. During the reconciliation and calm phases, the relief and affection that follow the abusive incident trigger dopamine release in the victim's brain, the same reward signaling chemical active during the honeymoon phase. The abusive partner is simultaneously the source of the threat and the source of the relief from that threat. That combination is neurochemically potent in a way that consistent positive treatment simply is not. This is the intermittent reinforcement effect, and it is not unique to abusive relationships. Behavioral psychology has documented for decades that rewards delivered unpredictably and inconsistently produce stronger behavioral conditioning than rewards delivered reliably. A slot machine pays out less than a salary, but it produces considerably more compulsive behavior. The unpredictability is the mechanism, not an incidental feature. In a trauma-bonded relationship, the victim's nervous system becomes calibrated to the cycle. The tension phase activates hypervigilance, constant monitoring of the partner's mood for early warning signals. The incident activates the threat response. The reconciliation produces relief so profound it registers as genuine warmth. Over time, the attachment system becomes organized around this cycle in a way that can make the relationship feel more intensely connecting than relationships that were never dangerous. This is the part that tends to be most difficult for outside observers to grasp. Survivors of these relationships frequently describe them as the most intense and meaningful connections of their lives, not despite the cycle, but partly because of the neurochemical landscape the cycle produced. Proximity seeking, which we covered as a survival mechanism, adds another layer of complexity here. Threat activates the attachment system and drives people toward their attachment figures. When the attachment figure is also the source of the threat, the system cannot resolve that contradiction. The result is not indifference. It is intensified attachment. The same impossibility at the root of disorganized attachment, now operating in an adult relationship. The trauma bond is also maintained by progressive isolation, a deliberate or instinctive pattern in many abusive dynamics where the victim's external support networks erode over time, leaving the abusive partner as the primary attachment figure by default. When the person causing harm is also the primary source of emotional regulation, escape becomes neurologically as well as practically difficult. The clinical implication is important. Telling a trauma-bonded person to simply leave misunderstands what they are being asked to do. They are being asked to sever what their nervous system has registered as their primary attachment bond, at a moment when that same nervous system is under acute threat. The fact that many people in this situation don't immediately leave is not weakness, confusion, or poor judgment. It is the attachment system functioning almost exactly as designed in conditions it was never designed for. Intermittent reinforcement was touched on in the trauma bonding entry as the mechanism driving the cycle's addictive pull. The concept runs deep enough and applies broadly enough that it deserves its own examination. The foundational research belongs to B.F. Skinner, the American behaviorist who spent much of the mid-20th century mapping the precise relationships between reward delivery and behavioral conditioning. Skinner worked primarily with animals in controlled laboratory settings, using what became known as operant conditioning chambers, boxes fitted with levers that animals could press to receive food rewards. What he was looking for was not simply whether rewards changed behavior, but how the timing and predictability of those rewards affected the strength and persistence of the conditioning. What he found was counterintuitive enough that it has remained one of the most replicated findings in behavioral psychology. Consistent reward, pressing the lever always produces food, produces reliable behavior, but behavior that extinguishes relatively quickly once the reward stops coming. The animal learns the rule, follows it, and abandons it when the rule changes. Variable reward. Pressing the lever sometimes produces food, unpredictably, produces something else entirely. The behavior becomes more frequent, more persistent, and dramatically more resistant to extinction. The animal keeps pressing long after the reward has stopped coming, because the absence of a reward has never reliably signaled that rewards won't return. The uncertainty itself drives the behavior. Skinner called this a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, and it is the same principle underlying the design of slot machines, social media notification systems, and certain dating dynamics that people find inexplicably difficult to disengage from. The industries built on this principle are not operating on intuition. They are operating on Skinner's data. In human attachment contexts, the variable ratio schedule interacts with the bonding system in a specific way. Consistent warmth and availability from a partner is genuinely pleasant, but it is also predictable, and predictability, while comfortable, does not produce the same neurochemical response as relief following uncertainty. When affection arrives unpredictably, after periods of coldness, withdrawal, or tension, the dopamine response to that affection is amplified. The reward lands harder because it wasn't guaranteed. This is why people frequently describe relationships defined by inconsistency as feeling more intensely connecting than stable ones. Not because instability is actually more intimate, but because the variable reward schedule has produced a stronger behavioral and neurochemical imprint than consistency ever could. The applications extend well beyond romantic relationships. Parent-child dynamics operating on intermittent reinforcement, a parent who is sometimes warm and sometimes critical or emotionally unavailable in unpredictable patterns, produce children whose attachment behavior becomes organized around maximizing the chances of catching the parent in a receptive state. That hypervigilance, and the intense relief when it pays off, can establish a relational template that the person then unconsciously recreates in adult relationships. Dr. Judith Herman, whose work on complex trauma remains foundational in the field, noted that relationships characterized by intermittent reinforcement often produce stronger apparent attachment than consistently loving ones, an observation that seems paradoxical until the Skinnerian framework makes it inevitable. The reason this matters practically is that understanding the mechanism changes what leaving or changing the dynamic actually requires. The pull a person feels toward an intermittently reinforcing relationship isn't irrational sentiment or weakness. It is a conditioned behavioral response that was built through exactly the kind of repeated variable reward exposure that behavioral psychology predicts will be the hardest to extinguish. Knowing that doesn't make it easier to walk away, but it does mean the difficulty is a measurable, documented phenomenon, not a personal failing. Limerence is a word most people have never encountered, describing an experience almost everyone has had, and the gap between those two facts is significant, because without a name for it, most people assume what they're feeling is simply love. Dorothy Tenov coined the term in her 1979 book, Love and Limerence: The Experience of Being in Love, after interviewing over 500 people about their experiences of intense romantic infatuation. What she found, consistently enough to warrant a new category, was a distinct psychological state that differed from love in ways that mattered, and that the people experiencing it were frequently unable to distinguish from love precisely because the feeling was so overwhelming. Limerence is defined by three core features. The first is intrusive, involuntary thinking about the object of the infatuation, the limerent object in Tenov's terminology, not daydreaming, not enjoying thoughts of someone, thoughts that arrive without invitation and resist dismissal. Tenov's subjects reported spending between 85 and 100% of their waking hours thinking about the limerent object at peak intensity. For context, that leaves very little cognitive bandwidth for anything else, including basic functioning. The second feature is an acute sensitivity to the limerent object's behavior, specifically where that behavior might be read as reciprocation, a longer glance than usual, a reply that came faster than expected, a particular word choice in a message. These signals get magnified and analyzed with a thoroughness that would be impressive if it weren't also exhausting. The limerent person is essentially running a continuous obsessive probability calculation. Does this person feel the same way? The third feature, and the one that most clearly separates limerence from straightforward attraction, is that the state is specifically fueled by uncertainty. Tenov found that limerence does not require the limerent object to be unavailable, but it requires them to be uncertain. Definitive rejection tends to collapse limerence over time. Definitive reciprocation also tends to dissolve it. The obsessive quality fades once the uncertainty is resolved. It is the unresolved question that keeps the engine running. This connects directly back to the intermittent reinforcement framework. The hope-uncertainty cycle Tenov documented is structurally identical to a variable reward schedule. Every ambiguous signal from the limerent object functions as an unpredictable reward, and the behavioral and neurochemical response follows accordingly. The neurochemical picture aligns with what we've already covered from honeymoon phase research. Limerence involves elevated dopamine and norepinephrine, suppressed serotonin, and the kind of intrusive, looping cognitive pattern that Donatella Marazzidi's research linked to obsessive-compulsive presentations. Tenov arrived at limerence through interviews and phenomenology. The neuroscience, arriving decades later, confirmed what her subjects had been describing. One of the more uncomfortable implications of Tenov's framework is the distinction it draws between limerence and love. The two can coexist, but they are not the same thing. Limerence is involuntary, unstable, and contingent on uncertainty. Love, in Tenov's framing, involves genuine concern for the other person's well-being, independent of whether they reciprocate. A person in the grip of limerence is primarily oriented toward their own internal state and the question of reciprocation. A person who loves someone is oriented toward the other person. Tenov noted that limerence, left unresolved and unrequited, can persist for years. The longest cases in her research extended over a decade, maintained largely by just enough ambiguity to keep the probability calculation running. The concept has resurfaced with considerable force in online communities in recent years, particularly in spaces focused on attachment and relationship psychology. People encountering the term for the first time frequently report a specific kind of recognition, the feeling of having had an experience they couldn't quite articulate suddenly named with precision. That reaction is itself informative. Tenov gave language to something that had been happening to people throughout recorded history without ever being clearly distinguished from the thing people actually meant when they said they were in love. Love bombing is a term that has migrated from clinical psychology into mainstream relationship vocabulary over the last decade. And unlike most concepts that undergo that journey, the popular definition is reasonably accurate. The clinical detail underneath it, however, is more specific and more deliberately engineered than the everyday usage tends to convey. The term itself is generally attributed to the cult research literature before it was applied to interpersonal relationships. Robert Lifton, whose 1961 work, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, remains a foundational text in the study of high control groups, documented the recruitment tactic of overwhelming new members with intense attention, warmth, and a sense of having finally found complete acceptance. The technique was observed in detail in groups like the Unification Church, the so-called Moonies, where it was systematic enough that former members coined the phrase themselves to describe what had happened to them. The mechanism was later recognized in individual interpersonal dynamics, particularly those involving narcissistic personality presentations, and what became clear was that whether the context was a cult recruitment center or a first date, the neurochemical target was identical. Love bombing works by artificially accelerating the bonding process through stimulus saturation. The target receives volumes of attention, affirmation, and apparent deep understanding in a compressed time frame. Daily contact, intense conversations that feel unusually intimate unusually quickly, declarations of connection that seem premature by any conventional measure. The dopamine and norepinephrine response this triggers is real. The nervous system doesn't evaluate whether the input is proportionate or sustainable before responding to it. It registers reward, and it bonds accordingly. The critical feature that separates love bombing from genuine early relationship enthusiasm is the function it serves. Authentic intensity in early relationships, however overwhelming, is not strategic. Love bombing is a setup. The intense attention creates a rapid attachment, an inflated internal working model of the other person as uniquely attentive, understanding, and irreplaceable, before the target has had enough time or normal relational experience with that person to evaluate whether the image is accurate. Once the attachment is established, the dynamic shifts, the attention withdraws, the validation becomes conditional, or the control begins, and because the target is now bonded to the idealized version of the person they encountered at the start, the natural response is to try to recover that version, to find out what changed, to fix whatever caused the withdrawal, to earn back the intensity that felt so extraordinary. That pivot is the point. The manufactured bond creates exactly the compliance and proximity-seeking behavior the love bomber, consciously or not, was engineering toward. The overlap with intermittent reinforcement is direct. The shift from overwhelming positive attention to withdrawal installs the variable reward schedule. The target has already experienced what a high-reward interaction with this person feels like. Now they're working to get back there. The slot machine has been primed. Dr. Diane Langberg, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma and abuse dynamics, has noted that love bombing is particularly effective on individuals with anxious attachment histories, people whose internal working models already encoded a deep hunger for consistent validation they didn't reliably receive early in life. The love bomber's initial intensity doesn't feel excessive to someone who has spent years accommodating emotional unavailability. It feels like finally being seen. The cult recruitment context is worth returning to, because it illustrates just how replicable the technique is when applied systematically. Former members of high control groups across traditions, from fringe religious movements to certain multi-level marketing organizations, describe almost identical induction experiences regardless of the group's stated ideology. The warmth, the instant belonging, the sense of being uniquely understood. The content varies, the method doesn't. Recognizing love bombing in real time is genuinely difficult, because the early experience of it feels indistinguishable from the kind of intense connection most people hope to find. The signals that something is off tend to be subtle, a pace that doesn't allow for normal evaluation, an implicit expectation of reciprocal commitment that arrives before the relationship has the foundation to support it, and a quality of attention that feels more like acquisition than genuine interest. The distinction, as with most things in this iceberg, is clearer in retrospect than it is while it's happening. The discard and hoovering cycle is the stage of narcissistic relationship dynamics that follows the love bombing phase, and the one that tends to leave the most lasting psychological damage, partly because of how little sense it makes from the outside. To map the full arc, love bombing establishes the idealized bond. What typically follows is a gradual or sudden shift into devaluation, a phase where the intense positive attention curdles into criticism, contempt, withdrawal, or emotional unpredictability. The target, operating from the internal working model formed during the love bombing period, generally responds by working harder to recover the relationship's earlier quality. That effort, and the compliance it produces, tends to sustain the dynamic for a period that varies widely, weeks, months, or years, before the discard. The discard can be dramatic or quiet. Some end with a sudden, complete withdrawal of contact. Others involve a slow erosion until the target is functionally alone in a relationship that still technically exists. What is consistent is the abruptness relative to the apparent stakes. The relationship was framed, often explicitly, as uniquely significant. The ending rarely matches that framing. Then, often after a period of silence, comes what clinicians and survivor communities call hoovering, named after the vacuum cleaner brand for what it attempts to do. The person who ended contact, or who allowed the relationship to collapse, reinitiates, sometimes with an apology, sometimes with a crisis requiring urgent support, sometimes with a simple message that contains just enough warmth to suggest that the earlier version of the relationship might still be available. The question people on the outside consistently ask is why this works. The target is often aware, at a conscious level, of exactly what happened. They may have processed it in therapy, discussed it at length with friends, and arrived at a clear intellectual understanding of the dynamic. And then the message arrives, and something shifts. The mechanism is not a failure of intelligence or self-awareness. It is the intermittent reinforcement schedule, reactivating precisely the conditioning it built during the love bombing phase. The internal working model formed in that early period encoded this specific person as the source of an unusually intense reward. That encoding doesn't dissolve because the conscious mind has updated its assessment. The two systems operate largely independently. There is also the object constancy dimension. For targets who already had impaired object constancy before the relationship began, the Hoover attempt tends to land with particular force, because the devaluation and discard phase, for someone without stable internal object representations, doesn't leave a clear integrated memory of the relationship. It leaves the idealized version and the painful version as two separate images. When the Hoover arrives carrying the texture of the idealized version, the painful version can become difficult to hold onto simultaneously. Dr. Ramani Durvasula, a clinical psychologist who has written and spoken extensively on narcissistic relationship patterns, describes hoovering as essentially a reassertion of supply, a term used in this context to mean the attention, validation, and emotional response the narcissistic individual extracts from close relationships. The discard happens when the current supply is depleted or a better source is available. The hoover happens when circumstances change. The alternative source doesn't work out. External stressors increase the need for validation, or simply enough time has passed that re-establishing contact seems viable. The target's pain, in this framework, is not the motivating factor in the hoover. Their availability is. The reason this cycle tends to repeat rather than resolve in a single instance is rooted in the same variable reward architecture that sustains any intermittent reinforcement pattern. Each hoover that succeeds reinforces the conditioned response. Each return to the relationship provides another cycle of hope before the devaluation resumes, and each resumption deepens the conditioning rather than breaking it. Exiting the cycle permanently typically requires something more than conscious resolve, though conscious resolve is not irrelevant. It requires disrupting the reinforcement pattern long enough for the conditioning to begin extinguishing, and doing so while the attachment system is registering the absence of its primary reward source as an active threat. That combination is why "just don't respond" is accurate advice that is considerably harder to follow than it sounds. How cults use attachment theory is not a loose analogy or a retroactive framework applied to make cult dynamics easier to explain. In a number of documented cases, the mechanics are described explicitly, in recruitment training materials, in former leaders' own writings, and in the testimonies of ex-members who later worked in mental health fields and recognized exactly what had been done to them. The starting point is the love bombing phase, which we've already examined in detail. In a cult context, this isn't the behavior of a single individual. It's a coordinated group effort. New recruits are surrounded by people who seem genuinely delighted by their presence, who listen with unusual attentiveness, who make them feel that they have found a community that understands them in a way the outside world never did. Former members of groups ranging from the International Church of Christ to NexIVM to the People's Temple describe nearly identical induction experiences, despite those groups having almost nothing else in common. The content changes. The technique doesn't. What cults do that individual love bombers typically don't is systematize the transition from warmth to control through a structured program rather than a single person's behavior. The group's stated ideology, rules, and internal hierarchy provide the architecture that would otherwise require one manipulative individual to maintain alone. Isolation follows, and it follows deliberately. External relationships, family, old friends, former colleagues, are framed as spiritually compromised, ideologically dangerous, or simply unequipped to understand the recruit's new life. This framing serves a function that maps directly onto attachment dynamics. It removes competing attachment figures and concentrates the recruit's bonding system entirely on the group and its leader. Once that process is complete, the group has effectively become the recruit's primary attachment network. Leaving doesn't just mean disagreeing with a set of beliefs. It means severing every significant relationship simultaneously. Stephen Hassan, a former Unification Church member who became a cult intervention counselor, developed what he calls the BITE model, behavior, information, thought, and emotional control, as a framework for identifying high-control group tactics. The emotional control component maps with striking precision onto anxious attachment dynamics. Members are kept in a state of chronic uncertainty about their standing, their spiritual progress, or the leader's approval. Validation is dispensed inconsistently and tied to compliance. The result is a group-wide anxious attachment orientation. Members hypervigilant to signals of approval or disapproval from authority figures, deeply invested in maintaining closeness with the group, and experiencing mounting distress at any perceived threat to that belonging. The leader figure in high-control groups tends to attract something closer to the disorganized attachment dynamic. Many cult leaders cultivate an atmosphere of unpredictability around themselves, moments of profound warmth alternating with sudden coldness, inexplicable rage, or public humiliation of members who were previously favored. Jim Jones of the People's Temple, Keith Raniere of NXYVM, and Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh each employed variations of this dynamic with documented consistency. The members around them were simultaneously drawn toward and destabilized by proximity to the leader. The same impossible bind at the root of disorganized attachment, now operating at a community scale. The manufactured dependency component is where the process becomes most difficult to exit. Cults systematically dismantle members' pre-existing coping skills, decision-making autonomy, and external reference points, replacing them with group-provided frameworks for interpreting every dimension of experience. After sufficient time inside this environment, members may genuinely lack the internal resources to navigate the outside world independently. The dependency isn't a side effect of cult membership. For many groups, it is a stated or unstated goal. Dr. Margaret Singer, a clinical psychologist at the University of California, Berkeley, spent decades interviewing former cult members and testified as an expert witness in numerous legal cases involving high-control groups. She was consistent in her position that cult recruitment does not primarily target psychologically vulnerable or unusually naive people. It targets humans, and specifically targets the attachment system that all humans share. The need for belonging, for validation, for a coherent framework that makes sense of the world, and for the relief of feeling genuinely accepted are not weaknesses to be exploited. They are universal. The groups that exploit them are simply very precise about how to do it. The exit process from a high-control group, for all these reasons, looks less like changing one's mind about a set of beliefs and more like the simultaneous collapse of an entire attachment network. Therapists who specialize in cult recovery, including those working within the framework Singer helped establish, describe the post-exit period as resembling acute grief combined with the disorientation of someone whose entire relational world has dissolved at once, which, functionally, is exactly what it is. Isolation as a bonding tool is one of the most consistent tactics documented across abusive relationships, high control groups, authoritarian political systems, and prisoner of war detention. Contexts so different from each other in almost every other respect that the consistency of this particular method is itself informative. The mechanism is straightforward enough to state in a single sentence, and that simplicity is part of why it works so reliably across such different applications. When a person's existing attachment relationships are removed or systematically degraded, the attachment system doesn't shut down. It redirects. Whatever relationships remain available become the target of the bonding energy that was previously distributed across a wider network, and those remaining relationships become correspondingly more intense, more necessary, and harder to step back from. This is not complicated psychology. It is proximity seeking operating under artificially constrained conditions. The controller doesn't need to be exceptionally compelling or unusually skilled at building rapport. They simply need to be present when everyone else has been removed. The process rarely announces itself as isolation. In abusive, intimate relationships, it tends to arrive as concern. A partner who expresses discomfort around certain friends, who frames family relationships as harmful or intrusive, who makes contact with the outside world incrementally more difficult or costly, until it becomes easier to let those connections lapse than to maintain them. The target, at each individual step, makes what seems like a reasonable accommodation. The cumulative effect of those accommodations is a person who looks up one day and finds their social world has contracted to a single point. In cult environments, as we covered in the previous entry, isolation is more programmatic. External relationships are ideologically contaminated, and the group provides a complete social replacement that makes the outside world feel unnecessary rather than forbidden. The effect on the attachment system is the same. The method of delivery is simply more efficient. What the historical record of authoritarian systems adds to this picture is scale. Techniques used in prisoner of war camps, documented extensively in the aftermath of the Korean War and later formalized in research by psychologist Robert Lifton, included the deliberate destruction of relationships between prisoners, encouraging informants, punishing group cohesion, rotating prisoners between cells to prevent stable bonds from forming. The goal was not simply to prevent escape planning, it was to produce individuals whose only available attachment figure was the captors themselves. Compliance and psychological dependency followed as a direct result. Biderman's chart of coercion, developed in 1957 by sociologist Albert Biderman after studying American prisoners of war, codified isolation as a primary coercive tool alongside sleep deprivation, monopolization of perception, and induced exhaustion. The chart was later recognized by domestic abuse researchers as mapping almost exactly onto the tactics used in abusive intimate relationships. Not because abusers had read Biderman, but because the underlying mechanism is consistent enough that people arrive at the same methods independently across vastly different contexts and centuries. That convergence is the most telling detail in the entire entry. Isolation doesn't require coordination, ideology, or sophisticated understanding of attachment theory. It requires only the recognition, conscious or instinctive, that a person with nowhere else to turn will turn toward whoever is left. The attachment system, built to ensure survival by keeping vulnerable people near protection, becomes the precise mechanism through which control is established. The biology that evolved to keep people safe is the same biology being used against them. The military and bonding engineering is one of the few contexts in which the deliberate manufacture of intense human bonding is not only openly acknowledged, but treated as a primary institutional objective, and the methods used to achieve it have been refined over centuries into something that works with remarkable consistency across cultures, militaries, and eras. The process begins with what researchers in military sociology call identity stripping. The first days of basic training are not primarily about physical fitness or weapons familiarity. They are about systematically dismantling the individual self that recruits arrive with. Uniforms remove visual individuality. Names give way to ranks or collective address. Personal histories, social hierarchies from civilian life, and individual preferences become irrelevant. The person who walked in is, by deliberate design, not the person who exists a week later. This is not incidental to the training process. It is the training process. A recruit who retains a strong individual identity centered on personal survival has different priorities than one whose identity has been rebuilt around the unit. The dismantling creates the space into which a new collective identity can be installed. What fills that space is constructed through a specific set of conditions that attachment researchers would recognize immediately. Shared suffering is probably the most powerful of these tools. Military training deliberately imposes physical exhaustion, sleep deprivation, discomfort, and stress, not purely to build physical capability, but because people who suffer together bond with a speed and depth that no amount of positive shared experience produces at the same rate. The neurochemical and psychological basis for this is documented. Shared threat activates the attachment system, and people who are present during that activation become associated with the relief of surviving it. The bonds formed in genuinely adverse conditions carry a quality of trust that is very difficult to manufacture through any other means. Sleep deprivation serves a dual function. It degrades the prefrontal cortex's regulatory capacity. As we've established, the brain's primary system for critical evaluation and independent judgment. A chronically sleep-deprived recruit is more emotionally reactive, more susceptible to group influence, and less capable of maintaining psychological distance from the shared experience of the unit. This is not a side effect of demanding training schedules. The research suggests it is a feature. Us versus them framing completes the architecture. By constructing a clear and consistent distinction between the in-group, the unit, the branch, the military as a whole, and various out-groups, military training activates the same tribal bonding mechanisms that evolutionary psychology has documented across human history. In-group identity strengthens in direct proportion to the clarity and perceived threat of the out-group. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, a former Army Ranger and professor of military science whose work on the psychology of combat is widely studied, has written extensively on how unit cohesion functions as the primary motivator in actual combat, consistently outweighing ideology, patriotism, and self-preservation in soldiers' own accounts of what kept them fighting. The bond with the people immediately around them, forged through shared suffering and manufactured identity, becomes the central organizing principle of behavior under fire. The resulting bonds are, by many measures, among the strongest human attachments documented anywhere in the psychological literature. Veterans who struggle to connect with family members after deployment frequently cite the intensity of unit cohesion as a reference point that civilian relationships find difficult to match, not because civilian relationships are inadequate, but because the conditions that produced those military bonds are not reproducible in ordinary life. Dr. Jonathan Shea, a psychiatrist who worked for decades with combat veterans and authored Achilles in Vietnam, a study of combat trauma through the lens of Homer's Iliad, described the loss of unit cohesion through casualties or the end of a deployment as a form of grief that military culture and civilian society are both largely unprepared to address. The bonds were real. Their sudden removal produces a loss that maps directly onto what attachment research would predict. The military didn't develop these techniques by studying attachment theory. Attachment theory, arriving later, simply confirmed what centuries of military experience had already established through trial and error: that human beings, placed under the right conditions, will bond to whoever is beside them with a depth that ordinary social life rarely approaches. The conditions were engineered. The bonds they produce are not any less genuine for it. Advertising and parasocial bonding is an entry that reframes something most people interact with dozens of times a day, and the reframe is uncomfortable enough that the advertising industry would rather you didn't think about it in these terms. The shift in advertising strategy from product promotion to relationship construction happened gradually over the 20th century, but its acceleration in the era of social media and influencer marketing has made the underlying mechanics considerably more visible. Modern brand strategy is not primarily trying to convince you that a product has superior qualities. It is trying to make you feel something toward the brand: familiarity, trust, warmth, identity alignment, that functions measurably like a low-grade attachment. The terminology used inside the industry makes this explicit. Brand love is not a metaphor in marketing literature. It is a measurable metric, assessed through the same dimensions used to evaluate interpersonal relationships: trust, consistency, emotional response, and the degree to which consumers feel the brand understands them. Brand consultancy. Havas Group has published annual Meaningful Brands reports for over a decade, tracking consumer relationships with brands using language that maps directly onto attachment proxies. How much would your life be affected if this brand disappeared? The answer, for certain brands, approaches the kind of response you'd expect from losing a close contact. Apple shows up more than any other brand in this research, and the reason why is worth sitting with. In 2011, neuroscientist Martin Lindstrom ran a study using functional MRI to track brain activity while participants looked at Apple branding. What the scans showed was that the regions lighting up were the same regions that activate when people look at someone they love. Not someone they admire, not something they prefer, someone they love. The participants weren't just expressing a brand preference. Their brains were processing a logo the same way they process a human being. The mechanisms advertising uses to produce this are the same ones that appear throughout this iceberg. Consistency and predictability across decades build something structurally similar to what an early responsive caregiver builds: a reliable, recognizable presence that the nervous system learns to associate with comfort and familiarity. Aspirational identity framing offers the brand as a reflection of who you are or want to be, an offer that is particularly potent for individuals whose own identity feels unstable or uncertain. Parasocial relationships with brand representatives, spokespeople, or influencers add a human face to the attachment target, activating the bonding system more directly than a logo alone can manage. The influencer economy made the human face component systematic. An influencer's audience doesn't have a relationship with a product. They have a parasocial relationship with a person, and that person's product endorsements carry the social weight of a recommendation from someone the audience has bonded with, despite the audience knowing, at a conscious level, that the relationship is one-directional and the endorsement is paid. The parasocial attachment formed with influencers and media personalities follows the same anxiety-proximity dynamics documented in interpersonal relationships. Audiences who feel a strong parasocial bond report distress when their parasocial partner takes extended absences, relief at their return, and a sense of personal loss when those figures end their public presence. These responses are not proportionate to what has actually been lost, but they are proportionate to what the attachment system registers as having been lost. Social media platforms refined this further by building variable reward schedules into the interface itself, the unpredictable delivery of likes, comments, and engagement feedback on content posted about or alongside brands. The scroll mechanic, the notification system, and the algorithmic unpredictability of what appears and when are all variable ratio reinforcement schedules running continuously, keeping the user in the engagement loop that Skinner documented, and that every subsequent entry on this iceberg has approached from a different angle. The sophistication of modern brand attachment engineering isn't that it discovered something new about human psychology. It's that it applied, with increasing precision, everything that was already known, and built the infrastructure to deliver it at scale, continuously, into the pockets of several billion people simultaneously. Bowlby was studying infants in laboratory settings. The advertising industry was taking notes. Dating apps and anxious attachment loops is an entry that sits at the intersection of everything this iceberg has covered so far, and the convergence is not coincidental. The basic architecture of mainstream dating apps contains several design elements that, when examined through the lens of behavioral psychology, are functionally identical to the reinforcement schedules we've already established as the most potent drivers of compulsive engagement. The question of whether this is deliberate engineering or the natural result of optimizing for engagement metrics is genuinely open. But from a neurochemical standpoint, the intent matters considerably less than the effect. The matching system is the foundational mechanism. A match, two users mutually indicating interest, arrives unpredictably, at no guaranteed interval, with no reliable relationship to the effort invested in the preceding period of use. The delivery pattern is a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, operating in precise accordance with Skinner's findings. The notification that announces a match triggers a dopamine response that the app's designers almost certainly track in engagement data, whether or not they frame it in those terms internally. The swipe mechanic adds a behavioral component. The physical gesture of swiping is operant conditioning made literal, a lever press with a variable outcome. Most swipes produce nothing. Occasionally, one produces a match. The ratio of nothing to reward is calibrated, partly by the algorithm and partly by the user's own selectivity, to sit in the range that produces maximum continued engagement rather than the range that produces satisfied users who find what they're looking for and leave the app. Match disappearance, the mechanic in several major apps where uncontacted matches expire after a set window, introduces artificial scarcity and time pressure that amplifies the anxiety response around each individual match. The user now has a deadline attached to an uncertain reward. This is the variable ratio schedule with a loss aversion component added on top of it, and loss aversion is one of the more robustly documented cognitive biases in behavioral economics. Losing something you already have produces a stronger response than gaining something equivalent. A disappearing match activates both systems simultaneously. The result, for users with anxious attachment orientations, is an environment that is almost perfectly calibrated to amplify their existing relational hypervigilance. The app demands constant monitoring of who has matched, who has responded, what the response means, whether the response is cooling, whether the lack of response signals disinterest, or simply timing. The interpretive labor that anxiously attached individuals already apply to real relationships is now applied to interactions with strangers, at scale, through a medium that provides maximum ambiguity and minimum context. For avoidantly attached users, the infinite availability of new options within the app provides a ready-made exit from any interaction that begins to require emotional investment, a structural feature that reinforces avoidant patterns rather than creating conditions to work through them. The paradox of choice dimension, documented by psychologist Barry Schwartz well before dating apps existed, compounds this. When the pool of potential partners appears effectively unlimited, commitment to any individual becomes harder to sustain because the implicit alternative cost of that commitment is an infinite number of other possibilities. This isn't a personality flaw in the people experiencing it. It's a predictable psychological response to a specific choice architecture. Whether the major app developers understand the psychological mechanisms at work or simply optimize toward the engagement metrics that those mechanisms produce is a question that internal documentation would be required to answer definitively, and internal documentation of this kind has not been publicly released in meaningful form. What has been released through a combination of academic research, investigative journalism, and the testimonies of former employees at several major tech platforms is sufficient to establish that engagement optimization and psychological well-being are not the same objective and frequently point in opposite directions. The attachment system evolved to bond people to each other. Dating apps have built an environment in which that system is activated repeatedly, at high frequency, in connection with outcomes that are structurally designed to remain just uncertain enough to keep the user returning. Bowlby's infant pressing toward a caregiver who might or might not respond. The lever in Skinner's box, the slot machine, the same mechanism, a different interface. MK-ultra and attachment disruption is where this iceberg descends into territory that sounds like conspiracy fiction, and is, in fact, meticulously documented through declassified government records, congressional testimony, and the accounts of survivors whose lives were permanently altered by what was done to them. MK-ultra was a covert Central Intelligence Agency program that ran from the early 1950s through at least 1973, when CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the bulk of its files destroyed ahead of a congressional investigation. Enough survived, or was later recovered, to establish the program's scope with reasonable confidence. It involved over 150 research projects, funded through front organizations and conducted at universities, hospitals, and prisons across the United States and Canada, largely without the knowledge or meaningful consent of the subjects involved. The program's broad objective was the development of techniques for psychological manipulation, methods to extract information, implant false beliefs, and alter behavior in ways that existing interrogation methods could not achieve. Within that larger project, a subset of research became specifically focused on a question that maps with uncomfortable directness onto everything this iceberg has covered. Could you systematically dismantle a person's existing psychological identity, including their memories, beliefs, and relational attachments, and rebuild it according to a new template? The most extensively documented attempt to answer that question was conducted not by the CIA directly, but by Dr. Ewan Cameron, a Scottish-born psychiatrist who was, at the time, one of the most credentialed figures in his field. Cameron was president of the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the World Psychiatric Association at various points in his career. He was not a fringe figure operating in secret. He was the establishment. Cameron worked at the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University in Montreal, and his research was funded through a CIA-front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. His central theory, which he called psychic driving, and later framed under the broader concept of depatterning, held that existing maladaptive psychological patterns could be erased through sufficient disruption of the brain's normal functioning, and that a new, healthier pattern could then be installed in the cleared space. The method he used to achieve this erasure was, by any contemporary standard, the systematic application of everything attachment research has identified as most damaging to the human nervous system. Patients, many of whom had come to the Allen Memorial Institute seeking treatment for relatively ordinary conditions like anxiety and mild depression, were subjected to drug-induced sleep lasting weeks or months at a time, maintained through combinations of barbiturates and other sedating agents. During and around these extended sleep periods, Cameron administered electroconvulsive therapy at doses and frequencies far beyond established clinical norms, in some cases 10 to 30 times the intensity considered standard at the time. The declared goal was to produce a regression to a blank psychological state. Sensory deprivation was layered on top of this. Patients were placed in isolated rooms, fitted with goggles and gloves to eliminate sensory input, and kept in this condition for extended periods. The neurological effects of prolonged sensory deprivation on identity and reality testing are well established. The brain, deprived of external input, begins generating its own, and the boundary between self and environment becomes increasingly unstable. Then came the repatterning phase. While patients were in chemically and neurologically degraded states, Cameron played looped audio recordings, sometimes for 16 hours a day, containing messages he had designed to install new behavioral patterns. The recordings told patients things about themselves, their relationships, and their behaviors that Cameron had determined they should believe. The results were not the therapeutic breakthroughs Cameron had theorized. They were catastrophic. Survivors of the experiments reported permanent memory loss, not the targeted erasure of maladaptive patterns Cameron claimed to be after, but wholesale destruction of autobiographical memory, including language skills, the ability to recognize family members, and basic functional capabilities. Several patients lost years of their lives. Some never recovered meaningful function. The Canadian government settled with Cameron's surviving victims in 1992. The CIA settled separately with a group of plaintiffs in 1988, paying out approximately $750,000 without admitting liability. What Cameron's experiments demonstrated, in the most brutal possible terms, was that the attachment system and its associated identity structures are not modular features that can be selectively erased and rewritten. They are woven through the entire architecture of the brain and nervous system in ways that Cameron's theoretical framework had not accounted for. Attempting to erase one dismantled everything. The conceptual framework Cameron was working from, that identity is a pattern overlaid on a neutral substrate that can be cleared and rewritten, turned out to be wrong at a fundamental level. The substrate and the pattern are not separable. The self is not installed on top of the brain. It is the brain, organized over time through exactly the developmental processes this iceberg has been tracing. Cameron didn't find a way to reset the attachment system. He found a way to destroy it, and then, having found it, applied it to patients who had asked him for help. The Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual is a 128-page document produced by the Central Intelligence Agency in 1963, declassified in 1997 following a Freedom of Information Act request by the Baltimore Sun, and currently available in full through the National Security Archive at George Washington University. It is one of the more remarkable documents in the public record, not because its existence was secret, but because its contents read, in significant portions, as an applied attachment theory manual, written by people who had never heard of Bowlby and arrived at the same conclusions through entirely different means. The manual was designed as a practical guide for CIA interrogators operating in the field. Its stated purpose was the extraction of reliable information from resistant subjects. Its method, laid out with considerable clinical precision, was the systematic dismantling of the subject's psychological stability through the deliberate manipulation of the same variables that attachment research identifies as foundational to human bonding and selfhood. The Kubark Manual opens its psychological section by establishing a core principle that runs through everything that follows. The goal of effective interrogation is not physical coercion, but the production of psychological regression, a return to an earlier, more dependent state in which the subject's adult coping mechanisms and autonomous identity are sufficiently degraded that compliance becomes the path of least resistance. The manual is explicit that this regression is most effectively achieved not through pain, which it notes can produce resistance and unreliable information, but through the controlled manipulation of the subject's relational and environmental conditions. Isolation is the first and most heavily emphasized tool. The manual recommends that subjects be held in conditions of complete social isolation prior to and during interrogation, not simply to prevent communication, but to produce the specific psychological deterioration that prolonged isolation reliably generates. The document cites research from sensory deprivation and isolation studies, noting that subjects deprived of external relational contact become progressively more disoriented, more emotionally dependent on whatever human contact is available, and significantly more susceptible to influence from whoever controls that contact. This maps directly onto the mechanism covered in the isolation entry. Remove the attachment network, concentrate bonding energy on the available figure, and the power differential becomes absolute. The manual then addresses what it calls the interrogator-subject relationship with a degree of psychological sophistication that is, in context, deeply unsettling. It recommends that the interrogator position themselves as the subject's primary source of both stress and relief, controlling the conditions of discomfort, while also being the person who can alleviate them. The subject should come to understand, implicitly rather than explicitly, that their psychological and physical well-being is entirely contingent on their relationship with the interrogator. This is the trauma bonding cycle, formalized as operational procedure. Tension and relief, administered by the same person, producing attachment under duress. The manual also addresses the manufactured dependency component with notable directness. It notes that subjects who have been sufficiently isolated and disoriented develop genuine psychological need for the interrogator's presence, not as a performance, but as an actual dependency produced by the conditions of captivity. The interrogator is instructed to cultivate this dependency carefully, using it as the primary lever of compliance rather than relying on explicit threats. The document also devotes considerable attention to identity disruption, specifically the erosion of the subject's sense of self as a precondition for behavioral change. Techniques including temporal disorientation, disruption of sleep cycles, environmental unpredictability, and the systematic invalidation of the subject's perceptions of reality are described in operational terms. The language is measured and bureaucratic throughout, which makes the content more rather than less disturbing on close reading. The Kubark Manual predates the formal consolidation of attachment theory by years. Ainsworth's strange situation studies were still a decade away when the document was written. And yet the psychological architecture it describes, isolation producing dependency, controlled relief producing compliance, identity disruption enabling behavioral reconstruction, follows the logic of attachment disruption with a precision that suggests the underlying human vulnerabilities are consistent enough to be discovered independently by anyone applying sufficient systematic attention to the question of how people break. A revised version of the manual, the Human Resource Exploitation Training Manual, was produced in 1983 and used in training programs delivered across Latin America during that period. A 1994 investigation by the Baltimore Sun and subsequent congressional scrutiny connected the manual's methods to documented human rights abuses in several countries. The Kubark document is publicly available. It is rarely included in mainstream discussions of psychological research or attachment science, perhaps because the application it describes sits far outside the contexts in which those fields prefer to situate their findings. But the knowledge it draws on is the same knowledge. The difference is only in what it was used for. Learned helplessness enters this iceberg as both a standalone psychological phenomenon and a missing piece in understanding why prolonged exposure to the dynamics we've been examining, isolation, intermittent reinforcement, identity disruption, can produce states of dependency that persist long after the original conditions have changed. Martin Seligman developed the concept in the late 1960s through a series of experiments that he later described as among the most ethically uncomfortable of his career. Working with dogs at the University of Pennsylvania alongside colleague Stephen Meyer, Seligman exposed subjects to mild electric shocks that could initially be avoided or stopped through a specific action. A second group received shocks they had no means of controlling, identical in intensity, but completely unresponsive to anything the animal did. When both groups were later placed in a new situation where escape was straightforwardly available, the results divided sharply. Dogs from the first group learned the escape route quickly. Dogs from the second group largely did not attempt to escape at all. They lay down. They endured the shocks passively. They had learned, through repeated experience of uncontrollable adversity, that their actions had no effect on their outcomes, and that learning transferred to new situations where it was no longer accurate. Seligman called this learned helplessness, the acquired belief that one's behavior is decoupled from consequences, produced by sustained exposure to inescapable adverse conditions. The human applications were established through subsequent research, including work by Seligman himself, and later by psychologist Lynn Abramson, who extended the model to account for how people explain their helplessness to themselves, whether they attribute it to something permanent and global about themselves or something specific and temporary. The former produces significantly worse outcomes, including clinical depression, which Seligman and colleagues proposed was in many cases learned helplessness applied to the self. The connection to bonding dynamics is where the research moves into territory that rarely gets discussed in standard presentations of Seligman's work. A person in a state of learned helplessness has had their sense of agency systematically dismantled. They have learned, at a level that feels factual rather than interpretive, that effort does not reliably produce relief. That belief doesn't stay contained to the original context. It generalizes, coloring the person's relationship to future challenges, future relationships, and their own capacity to influence their circumstances. This creates a specific vulnerability. When an individual in a learned helplessness state encounters someone who appears to offer genuine relief, consistent warmth, apparent stability, a sense of being understood after a prolonged period of feeling powerless, the attachment response to that person is amplified well beyond what the circumstances would ordinarily warrant. The relief isn't just pleasant. Against the backdrop of extended helplessness, it is neurochemically overwhelming. The bonding that results is correspondingly intense and disproportionately difficult to step back from, even when the relationship that forms around it is not healthy. This dynamic appears repeatedly in the clinical literature on recovery from abusive relationships, cult exit, and extended institutional trauma. People who have been in conditions that induced learned helplessness, whether through prolonged emotional control, unpredictable punishment, or systematic removal of autonomy, often form rapid, powerful attachments to whoever provides relief during or immediately after that period. The attachment system, operating in a depleted and destabilized environment, bonds aggressively to whatever stability presents itself. Dr. Judith Herman documented this pattern in Trauma and Recovery, noting that survivors of prolonged control often describe intense attachment to figures who were themselves imperfect or even harmful, not because those figures were genuinely safe, but because they represented the first available relief after a period of helplessness. The bar, set by the preceding conditions, was on the floor. Seligman's later career moved toward positive psychology and the study of resilience, in some ways a direct response to the bleakness of his early findings. But the learned helplessness research remains the foundation, and the vulnerability it describes has never been adequately resolved by simply telling people to think differently. The state was learned, which means the conditions that produced it were real. And understanding that distinction matters enormously for anyone trying to make sense of why people bond the way they do after extended exposure to conditions they couldn't control. Social isolation as a control mechanism extends the previous entry's framework from an induced psychological state into a deliberately administered one, and the consistency of its effects across prisons, authoritarian states, and high-control religious institutions suggests that whoever designs these systems, regardless of their stated rationale, has arrived at the same operational understanding of human vulnerability. Solitary confinement is the most extensively documented application in the modern record. In United States correctional facilities, solitary confinement, formerly called restrictive housing in most institutional literature, which itself tells you something, involves the placement of individuals in single-occupancy cells for 22 to 24 hours per day, with minimal human contact and severely restricted environmental stimulation. The practice is used on approximately 80,000 people on any given day in American prisons, according to figures from the Association of State Correctional Administrators. The psychological deterioration that follows prolonged solitary confinement has been documented with enough consistency that it now constitutes a recognized clinical pattern. Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School who conducted extensive interviews with solitary confinement prisoners beginning in the 1980s, identified a syndrome characterized by hypersensitivity to stimulation, perceptual distortions, cognitive disruption, difficulty with thinking and concentration, intrusive aggressive imagery, and in severe cases, frank psychiatric breakdown, including hallucinations and dissociative episodes. These were not pre-existing conditions in all cases. They were produced by the conditions of isolation. The United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, the Nelson Mandela Rules, revised in 2015, define prolonged solitary confinement beyond 15 consecutive days as cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The United States has not formally adopted this standard as binding. Authoritarian states have historically used enforced social isolation as a primary instrument of political control, typically targeting individuals whose ability to organize or communicate ideas posed the greatest threat. The Soviet psychiatric prison system, which detained political dissidents in psychiatric institutions under diagnoses, including sluggish schizophrenia, a condition invented specifically for the purpose, combined isolation with pharmacological intervention and deliberate identity invalidation. The goal was not simply silence, but the production of individuals whose capacity for coherent selfhood and reliable social connection had been sufficiently degraded that reintegration into oppositional networks became practically impossible. Accounts from survivors of both Soviet psychiatric detention and Chinese re-education facilities in more recent decades describe an almost identical post-release experience. A period of profound disorientation, heightened sensitivity to social stimuli, and an acute, destabilizing hunger for connection that bears little resemblance to ordinary loneliness. The attachment system, deprived of input for an extended period, doesn't simply return to its pre-isolation baseline when contact becomes available again. It surges. This surge is the vulnerability that isolation, as a control mechanism, is partly designed to create. A person released from prolonged isolation into a structured environment, a prison general population, a religious community, a supervised release program, is neurologically primed to bond intensely with whatever social context receives them. The relief of contact after prolonged deprivation produces the same disproportionate attachment response documented in learned helplessness recovery. The bar has been set by the preceding conditions, and almost anything clears it. High-control religious groups have exploited this dynamic with particular efficiency by positioning themselves as the point of contact for members emerging from enforced withdrawal periods, retreat structures, shunning recovery, or the social isolation that results from having previously burned external relationships through the group's demands. The group is simultaneously the cause of the members' isolation from outside support and the only available source of relief from it. The resulting dependency is profound and self-reinforcing. The 1971 Stanford prison experiment, despite its serious methodological problems that have been more fully documented in recent years, did capture one dimension of this dynamic accurately: the speed with which individuals placed in socially constrained, hierarchically controlled environments begin organizing their psychology around the available power relationships. Philip Zimbardo's setup was compromised in ways that affect its conclusions about ordinary human behavior. But the underlying mechanism, that isolation from normal social context accelerates dependency on whatever social context remains, has survived the scrutiny his specific study has not. The exit from prolonged enforced isolation, regardless of the context that produced it, does not resemble a simple return to prior functioning. What it resembles, consistently across survivor accounts and clinical documentation, is the emergence of a person whose attachment system is running at maximum sensitivity in an environment they are no longer equipped to read clearly. That combination, heightened need, reduced capacity, is not a coincidence of recovery. In many cases, it was the point. Manufactured consensus and tribal bonding is an entry that connects the neuroscience of group belonging to the specific ways political and media systems have learned to exploit it, and the connection is grounded in measurable brain activity rather than political theory. The starting point is the neuroscience. Research using functional magnetic resonance imaging has shown that strong group identity activates the same neural reward circuitry as romantic attachment and close friendship. Belonging at the neurological level is not a vague positive feeling. It is a concrete reward signal, processed by many of the same structures that respond to the chemical cascade we mapped during the honeymoon phase. The brain treats meaningful group membership as a resource worth protecting, which means threats to that membership activate the same alarm systems as threats to physical safety. This is not a metaphor. A 2012 study by Naomi Eisenberger at the University of California, Los Angeles, demonstrated that social exclusion activates the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the same region that processes physical pain. Being left out and being hurt overlap in the brain more than language typically suggests. The in-group and out-group distinction works through a well-documented mechanism called social identity theory, developed by Henry Tajfel and John Turner in the 1970s and 80s. Tajfel's minimal group experiments established something that remains one of the more uncomfortable findings in social psychology. People will favor their in-group and discriminate against an out-group even when the group membership is entirely arbitrary, assigned by a coin flip, or based on a stated preference for one of two abstract painters. The content of the group identity is almost irrelevant. The structure of having an identity, with a corresponding boundary against those who don't share it, is sufficient to activate preferential bonding and competitive behavior. Political and media systems have built entire operational frameworks around this mechanism, in most cases without referencing the academic literature, because the practical knowledge of how group identity functions as a motivational tool predates the neuroscience that explains it by centuries. The manufactured consensus component operates through a specific process. When an individual is repeatedly exposed to a particular set of claims through trusted in-group sources, the social endorsement of those claims becomes entangled with the claims themselves. Accepting the consensus signals belonging. Questioning it signals potential exclusion. The epistemic and the social are not processed separately. They arrive together, and the social pressure shapes the epistemic outcome in ways that feel like independent reasoning. Eli Pariser's 2011 concept of the filter bubble, later expanded by researchers including Axel Bruns into the more nuanced echo chamber debate, identified how algorithmic content curation accelerates this process by reducing exposure to out-group perspectives while amplifying in-group signals. The research on whether algorithmically curated feeds actually produce more extreme views is contested, with some studies finding smaller effects than initially theorized. What is more consistently documented is the emotional activation dimension. Content that triggers in-group threat responses drives significantly higher engagement metrics than content that doesn't, which means platforms optimizing for engagement are, functionally, optimizing for tribal activation regardless of intent. The neuroscience of dehumanization adds the most disturbing layer. Lasana Harris and Susan Fisk at Princeton University demonstrated through neuroimaging that when subjects were shown images of people categorized as extreme outgroup members, in their study, homeless individuals and drug users, the medial prefrontal cortex, the region normally activated when processing other people as full human agents, showed significantly reduced activation. The brain, under conditions of strong outgroup framing, begins processing some humans as objects rather than persons. The implications for understanding how atrocity becomes possible extend well beyond political theory into the basic architecture of social cognition. Media and political actors who reliably characterize the opposing group in terms that activate this response, that frame them as threats to safety, to identity, to fundamental values, are not simply being rhetorically aggressive. They are doing something neurologically specific, priming the in-group's threat detection systems while simultaneously degrading the out-group's status as full human agents in the audience's social cognition. The bonding that results from shared threat is, as the military entry established, among the strongest the human attachment system produces. A population that believes itself under constant threat from a coherent outgroup will bond to its in-group with an intensity that serves the interests of whoever defines the threat. The mechanism requires no conspiracy to function. It only requires systems optimizing for engagement, political actors optimizing for loyalty, and a human brain that evolved in small tribal groups where the distinction between us and them was, for most of human history, a matter of survival. The brain hasn't updated. The systems exploiting it have. Oxytocin has been so thoroughly branded as the love hormone by popular science coverage that correcting the record requires dismantling something most people consider settled. The actual research on oxytocin is considerably more complicated and in some respects considerably darker than the wellness industry version suggests. The popular framing isn't entirely wrong. Oxytocin is released during childbirth, breastfeeding, physical touch, and close social bonding. It plays a genuine role in pair bonding, parental attachment, and the kind of warm social connection the greeting card version describes. The problem is that this account captures roughly half of what the hormone does, the half that makes for better marketing. The more complete picture began emerging from research led by Karsten de Dreux, a social psychologist at the University of Amsterdam, through a series of studies published around 2010 and 2011. De Dreux's team administered oxytocin to subjects through nasal spray, a delivery method that allows oxytocin to cross the blood-brain barrier, which it cannot do effectively on its own, and then measured behavior in economic games and social decision tasks involving both in-group members and out-group members. The findings reframed the hormone's function entirely. Oxytocin did increase prosocial behavior, trust, and generosity, but specifically and almost exclusively toward in-group members. Toward out-group members, the same oxytocin administration produced the opposite effect: increased suspicion, reduced cooperation, and in some conditions, measurable increases in defensive aggression, and what de Dreux's team called out-group derogation. The same chemical, the same dose. Opposite directional effects depending entirely on whether the target was classified as us or them. De Dreux proposed that oxytocin is not a bonding hormone in the general sense, but a parochial bonding hormone, one that evolved to strengthen in-group cohesion, specifically in contexts of intergroup competition. In environments where group survival depended on cooperation within the group and wariness toward rival groups, a hormone that simultaneously increased internal trust and external suspicion would be extraordinarily adaptive. It is, in that framing, less a love chemical than a loyalty chemical, with everything that implies about what loyalty requires an enemy for. Subsequent research has added layers to this picture. A 2011 study published in the journal Science, also involving de Dreux's group, found that oxytocin specifically promoted tend and defend behavior, increasing willingness to act aggressively in defense of in-group members, including preemptive defensive aggression based on anticipated threat rather than actual provocation. Subjects under oxytocin administration were more likely to harm out-group members if they believed doing so would protect their in-group, not from malice, but from an amplified protective impulse toward those they were bonded to. The implications for everything we've covered about tribal bonding and manufactured consensus are direct. The neurochemical that bonds people to their partners, their children, and their close communities is the same neurochemical that makes the boundaries of those communities feel worth defending against perceived intrusion. Bonding and hostility are not opposing forces running on separate systems. They are, in the oxytocin research, opposite expressions of the same underlying mechanism. This also reframes some of the darker dynamics covered earlier in the iceberg. The intense bonding produced by trauma, shared suffering, cult membership, and military unit cohesion is oxytocin-mediated in part, and the hostility those same bonded groups direct toward outside figures and institutions is not a separate feature of group psychology. It is the other side of the same hormonal response. The popular framing of oxytocin as a simple positive, spray it in an office, improve teamwork, enhance trust, ignores the targeting system built into the hormone's function. Oxytocin doesn't increase generalized warmth toward people in general. It increases warmth toward whoever is already classified as in-group, and it appears to sharpen the distinction between that group and everyone else. The love hormone is real. It just comes with a boundary, and it takes that boundary seriously. Mirror neurons entered public consciousness in the 1990s with a set of claims so sweeping that neuroscientists who had spent careers studying empathy and social cognition found themselves in the unusual position of urging caution about findings that seemed to confirm everything they already suspected. The discovery happened almost by accident. In the early 1990s, neuroscientist Giacomo Rizzolatti and his colleagues at the University of Parma were recording activity from individual neurons in the premotor cortex of macaque monkeys, neurons associated with planning and executing specific hand movements. On an ordinary day in the lab, a researcher reached for an object while a monkey sat with recording electrodes in place. The neurons that fired in the monkey's brain were the same neurons that fired when the monkey itself reached for the same object. The monkey wasn't moving. It was watching someone else move, and its motor system was responding as though it were performing the action itself. Rizzolatti's team identified a class of neurons that activated both during the execution of an action and during the observation of that same action performed by another. They called them mirror neurons. The findings were published in 1992 and generated immediate and significant interest from researchers well outside motor neuroscience. The leap to human social behavior was rapid and, in hindsight, probably too rapid. Neuroscientist Vilayanur Ramachandran described mirror neurons in a 2000 essay as potentially doing for psychology what DNA did for biology, a claim that reflected genuine excitement but considerably outpaced the available evidence. The popular science version that followed suggested mirror neurons were the neurological foundation of empathy, imitation, language acquisition, and human social bonding in general. Books, articles, and TED Talks built entire frameworks on this foundation. The scientific pushback began accumulating through the 2000s and accelerated significantly around 2013. The core problem was methodological. Direct single neuron recording in humans, which was how mirror neurons were identified in macaques, is only possible in very limited clinical contexts. The evidence for a human mirror neuron system was largely inferred from neuroimaging data, and that inferential step turned out to be less solid than initially presented. Researcher Gregory Hickok published a detailed critique in 2009 and later expanded it into a 2014 book titled The Myth of Mirror Neurons, systematically challenging the evidence for most of the broader claims. The current scientific consensus is that the original mirror neuron claims were significantly overstated, and that the elegant unified theory of social cognition they seem to offer has not survived empirical scrutiny in the form it was originally proposed. What has survived is something more modest and more interesting in some ways: the phenomenon of emotional contagion. Emotional contagion is the tendency of people to automatically and unconsciously adopt the emotional states of those around them, to catch an emotion from another person through facial expression, posture, vocal tone, and behavioral mimicry, without deliberate effort or awareness. This phenomenon is robustly documented and does not depend on the mirror neuron hypothesis being correct. Its mechanisms are partially distinct from what Rizzolatti's findings were claimed to explain. Elaine Hatfield, a psychologist at the University of Hawaii who has studied emotional contagion since the 1980s, documented the process in detail. People automatically and continuously mimic the micro-expressions and postural cues of those around them, and through a feedback loop between the body and the brain, the facial feedback hypothesis. This mimicry produces corresponding shifts in their own emotional experience. You don't consciously decide to feel what the person next to you is feeling. Your face moves first, and your emotional state follows. The implications for attachment and bonding are significant. Emotional contagion means that close relationships involve a continuous, largely unconscious process of emotional synchronization, a mechanism that research by psychologist James Gross and others has connected to relationship satisfaction, empathic accuracy, and the co-regulatory function of close relationships that Tronic's still face experiment demonstrated in its most stark form. The social network dimension extends this further. Research by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler, published in the British Medical Journal in 2008, documented that emotional states, including happiness and depression, spread through social networks up to 3 degrees of separation. A friend of a friend of a friend experiencing elevated well-being is associated with a measurable increase in your own. The mechanism isn't fully resolved, but emotional contagion through direct and indirect contact is the leading candidate. The mirror neuron story is a useful lesson in how neuroscience gets communicated to the public, how a real and interesting finding gets amplified into a theory of everything, and how the correction, when it comes, rarely travels as far or as fast as the original claim. The neurons may not have been quite the revolution Ramachandran announced. The underlying human capacity for emotional synchrony they were recruited to explain is real, documented by other means, and woven through everything this iceberg has been describing. We catch each other's states. We always have. The mechanism is just less photogenic than a single-named neuron. Morphic resonance is one of those theories that the scientific establishment finds so fundamentally incompatible with established physics and biology that engaging with it seriously is considered, in many academic circles, a career risk. Rupert Sheldrake has spent several decades not particularly caring about that. Sheldrake is not a fringe figure by background. He holds a doctorate in biochemistry from Cambridge University, was a research fellow at Clare College, and conducted legitimate plant biology research before his interests moved in a direction that his former peers found increasingly difficult to follow. His 1981 book, A New Science of Life, outlined the theory of morphic resonance for the first time, and the response from the scientific community was swift. The journal Nature published an editorial that described the book as the best candidate for burning there has been for many years. Sheldrake, to his credit, has dined out on that quote ever since. The core claim is this: organisms of the same species share information across space and time through what Sheldrake calls morphic fields, invisible, non-physical fields that carry accumulated patterns of behavior, form, and memory. This information doesn't travel through any known physical medium. It doesn't attenuate with distance. It operates, in Sheldrake's framework, outside the conventional boundaries of space and time entirely. The bonding implications he draws from this are significant. If morphic fields exist and carry shared memory within species, then the boundary between individual organisms is not as fixed as conventional biology assumes. Bonding, in this framework, isn't purely a product of neurochemistry and direct interaction. It is a participation in a shared field that extends beyond the physical relationship between two individuals. Sheldrake has documented what he considers supporting evidence in several directions. One of his most frequently cited examples involves experiments where rats in one location learn a new maze, and rats of the same species in completely separate locations subsequently learn the same maze faster, without any conventional means of information transfer between the two groups. He has collected similar claims about human phenomena, including the widely reported experience of knowing a phone was about to ring before it does, or sensing that someone is staring at you from behind. His most extensively documented claim in the bonding context involves what he calls the sense of being stared at, the reported perception of another person's attention without any conventional sensory input. Sheldrake conducted thousands of trials on this phenomenon and published results suggesting performance above chance levels. Critics, including biologist Richard Dawkins and skeptic James Randi, have argued the experimental design contains methodological flaws that account for the results, flaws Sheldrake contests. The mainstream scientific objection to morphic resonance is not simply that the evidence is weak, though critics argue it is. The deeper problem is mechanistic. There is no proposed physical mechanism by which morphic fields could exist or transmit information, and the theory requires abandoning or significantly revising foundational principles in physics, chemistry, and biology simultaneously. Extraordinary claims, as the saying goes, require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence Sheldrake offers does not clear that bar for most researchers. Sheldrake's counter-argument is that the mechanistic objection is itself circular, that science's commitment to materialism prevents it from investigating phenomena that fall outside materialist assumptions, producing a closed epistemological loop that makes certain categories of evidence structurally invisible to conventional methodology. This is a philosophical argument rather than an empirical one, and it is not without some limited merit as a critique of scientific conservatism, even if it doesn't validate the specific theory. What makes morphic resonance worth including in a bonding iceberg is not its scientific standing. It has essentially none in mainstream biology. It is the question it is attempting to answer. The reported experiences that Sheldrake's theory was partly constructed to explain, the sense of deep connection that persists across distance, the feeling that certain relationships carry a quality that transcends ordinary physical interaction, are experiences that a significant number of people report, and that conventional neuroscience and attachment theory don't fully address at an experiential level. Whether Sheldrake's proposed mechanism is real is a separate question from whether the experiences his theory attempts to explain are worth taking seriously. The scientific consensus is clear on the former. The latter remains, for many people, an open matter. Generational trauma transmission is one of the more contested and consequential areas in contemporary biology, a field where the science is real enough to take seriously, and incomplete enough that significant caution is warranted before drawing broad conclusions. The mechanism at the center of this research is epigenetics, the study of changes in gene expression that don't involve alterations to the underlying DNA sequence itself. The basic concept is that genes can be switched on or off by environmental factors, and that some of these expression patterns can, under certain conditions, be passed to subsequent generations. The DNA code doesn't change. The way that code is read does, and that modified reading can, in some cases, be inherited. The Holocaust survivor research is the most frequently cited human study in this area. A 2016 paper led by Dr. Rachel Yehuda at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai examined epigenetic markers in Holocaust survivors and their adult children, comparing them to Jewish families of the same generation who had lived outside Europe during the war. The researchers found measurable differences in the methylation patterns of a gene associated with stress hormone regulation, specifically a gene linked to the functioning of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which governs the cortisol stress response system we've encountered several times in this iceberg. The children of survivors showed epigenetic patterns that resembled their parents' stress response profiles more closely than they resembled the control group, despite not having experienced the original trauma. Yehuda's interpretation was that the parental trauma had produced epigenetic changes that were transmitted to the next generation, predisposing those children to altered stress reactivity before they had encountered any significant adversity of their own. The study generated significant media attention and considerable scientific debate almost simultaneously. The criticisms were substantive. The sample sizes were small: 32 Holocaust survivors and 22 of their offspring in the primary analysis. Replication studies have produced mixed results. Some researchers argued the epigenetic differences observed could be explained by shared environment and parenting behavior rather than biological inheritance. That traumatized parents raise children in ways that shape stress responses through ordinary developmental pathways, without requiring any epigenetic transmission mechanism. The distinction between biological inheritance and environmentally mediated transmission through parenting is extremely difficult to disentangle in human studies, because the same family unit that would transmit epigenetic markers would also transmit trauma-influenced parenting styles, emotional contagion, attachment patterns, and the entire constellation of factors we've been examining throughout this iceberg. Separating the epigenetic signal from everything else happening in the same household requires either very large samples or animal models, and both have limitations. The animal model research is where the mechanistic evidence is strongest. Studies in mice, including work by Michael Meany at McGill University and later research by Isabel Mansuy at the University of Zurich, have demonstrated that stress-induced epigenetic changes in parent animals produce measurable behavioral and physiological differences in offspring who had no direct exposure to the original stressor. Mansuy's work specifically showed transmission across multiple generations in some cases. These findings are methodologically cleaner than human studies because researchers can control for environmental variables in ways that are impossible with human families. The working picture that most researchers currently accept is that epigenetic transmission of trauma-related changes is a real biological phenomenon in animals, that the human evidence is suggestive but not yet definitive, and that the actual intergenerational effects of trauma in humans are almost certainly produced by some combination of epigenetic, neurobiological, and relational pathways operating simultaneously. The relational pathway alone, without invoking epigenetics at all, is well established. Disorganized attachment, impaired object constancy, and the kinds of caregiving patterns produced by unresolved trauma have documented transmission mechanisms that require no new biology to explain. A traumatized parent who has not processed their trauma will, on average, produce a different caregiving environment than one who has, and the attachment research is unambiguous about what that means for the next generation's relational development. Epigenetic transmission, if it holds up at the human scale with more rigorous evidence, would add a biological layer beneath those relational mechanisms. The trauma wouldn't just shape how a parent behaves, it would alter the stress regulation architecture the child is born with. The Holocaust survivor studies remain some of the most discussed and most scrutinized research in this area. Yehuda herself has been careful to frame the findings as preliminary and has consistently called for replication. The popular coverage has been considerably less careful, which is a pattern that appears reliably wherever epigenetics intersects with emotionally resonant human history. What the research does establish, even in its current contested form, is that the boundary between one generation's experience and the next generation's biology may be more permeable than the prior consensus assumed. The implications for how we understand inherited vulnerability and inherited resilience are significant enough that the field will keep pursuing the question regardless of where any individual study lands. Remote viewing and emotional entanglement sits at the deepest and most speculative territory this iceberg has entered so far, a place where declassified government documents, legitimate experimental methodology, and results that mainstream science cannot comfortably accommodate exist in the same record simultaneously. The Stargate program was a United States government initiative that ran from 1972 through 1995, funded primarily by the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency, and conducted largely at Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California. It was not a fringe project operated by credulous bureaucrats. It was a response to credible intelligence suggesting the Soviet Union was investing heavily in psychic research for military applications, and the United States government's position, for over 2 decades, was that the possibility was serious enough to warrant systematic investigation with real funding. The program's primary focus was remote viewing, the claimed ability of trained individuals to perceive information about distant locations, objects, or events without any conventional sensory access. The 2 physicists who designed and ran the core experimental program at Stanford, Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, were credentialed researchers with prior legitimate careers in laser physics and quantum electronics, respectively. Their involvement wasn't a departure into fringe science as they understood it. They believed they were investigating a real phenomenon with real methodology. The experimental protocols they developed were designed specifically to rule out conventional explanations. Remote viewers were isolated. Target locations were selected randomly after the session began. Judges who evaluated the viewers' descriptions against potential target sites were blind to which site had been selected. The procedural controls were, by the standards of the era, reasonable. The results, across thousands of trials over 2 decades, were described by program statistician Jessica Utz, a professor at the University of California, Davis, and later president of the American Statistical Association, as showing effect sizes above what chance would predict. With statistical significance, she considered sufficient to conclude the phenomenon was real. Ray Hyman, a skeptical psychologist brought in to evaluate the same data, agreed the statistical results were not easily dismissed, but argued the methodology contained flaws that prevented a firm positive conclusion. The two evaluators looked at the same data and arrived at different interpretations of its meaning, which is itself a fair summary of where Stargate's findings remain today. The emotional entanglement dimension is a subset of the broader program that received less public attention. Several Stargate-adjacent experiments explored whether an emotional or relational bond between two individuals produced any measurable non-local effect, whether physiological responses in one person could be detected in another who was physically isolated and had no conventional means of receiving information about what the first person was experiencing. Experiments of this type, sometimes called presentiment or distant intention studies, were conducted by researchers including William Broad at the Mind Science Foundation in San Antonio. Broad's studies involved one person attempting to direct calming or activating attention toward another person in an isolated room while measuring the target person's electrodermal activity, skin conductance, a reliable marker of autonomic nervous system arousal. Across a substantial number of trials, Broad reported small but statistically above-chance correlations between the sender's intention and the receiver's physiological response. The bonding angle appeared in findings suggesting that pairs with established close emotional connections showed stronger effects than strangers. If the phenomenon was real, the existing relational bond appeared to be a relevant variable, which would place these experiments in direct conversation with everything this iceberg has examined about the biological substrate of attachment. Stargate was terminated in 1995 following an evaluation by the American Institutes for Research, which concluded the program had not produced actionable intelligence, and the phenomenon, even if real in some limited form, was not sufficiently reliable for operational use. The full program records were declassified and are publicly available through the CIA's online reading room. Several thousand documents covering 2 decades of experiments, personnel files, session transcripts, and internal evaluations. The scientific community's position on remote viewing and non-local emotional entanglement remains firmly skeptical. The replication record outside the original research groups is poor, and the proposed mechanism, whatever would allow information or intention to travel between isolated individuals without any known physical carrier, remains entirely unspecified. What the Stargate record does establish, beyond dispute, is that the United States government spent 23 years and approximately $20 million investigating whether human bonding creates connections that conventional physics cannot account for. The answer they arrived at was inconclusive enough that the debate has never fully closed. Whether that says something about the phenomenon, or about how governments respond to uncertainty during periods of geopolitical competition, is a question the declassified files alone cannot answer. "5G and social fragmentation theories occupy a specific corner of the modern conspiracy landscape where legitimate anxieties about technology, corporate power, and social disconnection get routed into a framework that mainstream science finds no empirical basis to support, but which, as a belief system, follows its own internal logic closely enough to warrant understanding on its own terms. The theory, in its various iterations, holds that 5th-generation wireless network technology, the infrastructure rollout that accelerated globally from around 2019 onward, operates at frequencies that interfere with natural human biological and social functioning. The more developed versions of this claim propose that this interference is not accidental. The deliberate disruption of natural human bonding, social cohesion, or electromagnetic coherence between people is framed as a feature of the technology rather than a side effect, a tool for population management, political control, or the advancement of some broader agenda depending on which version of the theory a given community has settled on. The scientific position on this is unambiguous. The radio frequency electromagnetic fields produced by 5G networks operate within frequency ranges that have been extensively studied, fall well below established safety thresholds, and have not been shown to produce the biological effects the theories describe. The World Health Organization, the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, and the relevant regulatory bodies in most countries with active 5G infrastructure have reviewed the available evidence and reached consistent conclusions. The conspiracy community's response to this consensus follows the same epistemic structure documented in authoritarian thought reform. Institutional consensus is itself evidence of institutional capture, which means scientific refutation functions as confirmation rather than correction. This is a closed loop, and it is worth naming as such. The 2020 period, during which 5G rollout coincided with global pandemic conditions and widespread social restriction, created conditions in which the theory spread with notable speed. Several cell towers in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands were physically damaged or destroyed by individuals acting on the belief that the infrastructure posed a public health threat. This put 5G conspiracy theories in a category of belief that produced real-world consequences, which is the threshold at which documenting a belief system becomes more than an academic exercise. The bonding dimension of the theory is the part that connects most directly to this iceberg. The claim that external technological infrastructure is deliberately disrupting natural human connection is, underneath the specific pseudoscience, articulating something that a significant number of people genuinely experience. A sense that modern life has made close human connection harder, more mediated, and less instinctively available than something in them registers it should be. That experience is real. The social fragmentation it points to is measurable. Loneliness statistics in developed nations have shown consistent upward trends for decades, documented extensively by researchers including Dr. Vivek Murthy, former United States Surgeon General, whose 2023 advisory on the loneliness epidemic cited data, suggesting that roughly half of American adults reported measurable loneliness before the pandemic period even began. The 5G theory doesn't cause that disconnection. It explains it, incorrectly, through a mechanism that doesn't exist, attributed to agents whose culpability the evidence doesn't support. But the underlying social pain that makes the explanation feel necessary is a separate matter from whether the explanation is accurate. Conspiracy theories that survive and spread tend to be ones that identify a real problem and propose a wrong answer. The real problem in this case is not invisible. It's just considerably less dramatic than a global wireless infrastructure conspiracy, and considerably harder to resolve. Screen time and attachment disruption conspiracy theories represent the more extreme end of a criticism spectrum that begins in well-documented territory and extends into claims that the evidence doesn't currently support, but which have attracted enough serious attention from credible figures that dismissing them entirely would require ignoring some uncomfortable facts about how the technology industry operates. The documented end of the spectrum is by now familiar ground. Former employees of major technology platforms have publicly described internal design philosophies explicitly oriented toward maximizing engagement at the expense of user well-being. Tristan Harris, a former design ethicist at Google who later founded the Center for Humane Technology, testified before the United States Senate in 2019 that the attention economy had produced a race to the bottom of the brainstem, a competition to exploit the most primitive reward circuitry available with intermittent reinforcement schedules, social validation loops, and variable notification systems deployed at a scale and sophistication that no individual user's willpower was designed to resist. The internal documents released during the 2021 Facebook papers revealed that the company's own researchers had identified significant harms to adolescent users, and that those findings had not produced corresponding changes to the platform's design priorities. None of that is conspiracy theory. It is the documented record. The more extreme version of the argument goes further. It proposes that the replacement of human bonding with device attachment is not an emergent consequence of engagement optimization, but a deliberate objective, that the erosion of close human relationships, family cohesion, and community solidarity serves identifiable interests in population management, political compliance, or the consolidation of economic and social control. In this framing, the technology companies are not negligent actors optimizing for profit at the expense of human flourishing. They are instruments of something more intentional. The figures associated with this broader claim range from tech critics operating in the mainstream, authors like Nicholas Carr, whose 2010 book, The Shallows, documented cognitive and attentional changes associated with internet use through legitimate neuroscience, to commentators making substantially more expansive claims about coordinated social engineering without proportionate evidence. The specific mechanism most frequently invoked in the extreme version is device bonding as a replacement for human bonding. The argument is that the attachment system, being opportunistic and responsive to available stimuli rather than selective about the nature of those stimuli, can be redirected from human relationships toward devices and platforms that simulate relational responsiveness, notifications, algorithmic personalization, the social feedback of likes and replies, producing a population whose primary attachment behaviors are directed at corporate-controlled infrastructure rather than toward each other. The first part of that claim has legitimate support. Research on problematic smartphone use has documented patterns of attachment behavior toward devices, anxiety during separation, preferential attention, relief upon reunion, that parallel the proximity-seeking behavior the attachment system was built to direct toward people. A 2019 study published in the journal Computers and Human Behavior found that smartphone separation produced cortisol elevation in heavy users comparable to mild social exclusion. The device, for some users, has been registered by the nervous system as an attachment object in a functionally meaningful sense. The second part, that this outcome is deliberately engineered as a control mechanism rather than a profitable side effect of engagement optimization, is where the evidence runs out and the framework shifts from documented corporate negligence into something that requires assuming coordinated intent across entities with otherwise competing interests. That's a significant evidential jump, and the publicly available record doesn't currently clear it. What the extreme version of this theory does, as with the 5G entry before it, is take a real and documented problem, the measurable erosion of deep human connection in populations with high smartphone and social media use, and route it through a mechanism that assigns deliberate agency to what may be, at its core, the predictable outcome of systems optimizing for engagement without adequate regard for what engagement costs. The difference between they knew it was harmful and didn't stop, and they planned the harm is not a small one, legally, morally, or empirically. The former is extensively documented. The latter remains for now in the territory of the unproven. That distinction doesn't make the outcome any less significant for the people experiencing it. The attachment system doesn't particularly care whether the disruption of its normal functioning was intentional or incidental. The result, in either case, is the same. The deliberate destruction of the nuclear family is an entry that spans a wider ideological and evidential range than almost anything else on this iceberg. From legitimate sociological debate about policy effects on family structure, through mainstream conservative social criticism, and into conspiracy frameworks that assign coordinated intentionality to what others describe as organic cultural evolution. The starting point is a set of facts that are not in dispute. Family structure in Western countries has changed dramatically over the last 60 years. Marriage rates have declined. Divorce rates rose sharply from the 1960s through the 1980s before partially stabilizing. Single-parent households became significantly more common. The extended family household, once a primary unit of economic and social support, is now relatively rare in most developed nations. Children are spending more time in institutional care from earlier ages. These are documented demographic shifts, and their effects on child development, economic mobility, and community cohesion are actively studied. The disagreement begins at the level of cause. The mainstream conservative version of the argument traces the breakdown of family structure to a combination of specific policy decisions and cultural shifts, without necessarily invoking coordinated intent. Daniel Patrick Moynihan's 1965 report, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, controversial then and now, argued that welfare policy structures were creating economic incentives that discouraged marriage in low-income communities, particularly Black American ones. The report generated enormous controversy, was accused of victim blaming, and was largely suppressed in policy discussions for a generation before being cautiously revisited by researchers including William Julius Wilson, who reached partially similar conclusions through different analytical frameworks. Charles Murray's 1984 book, Losing Ground, extended a version of this argument to welfare policy effects across class lines more broadly, arguing that the structure of mid-20th century social programs had inadvertently undermined the economic role of the male partner in low-income households, reducing the practical incentive for family formation. Murray's conclusions have been contested, but the underlying question, whether specific policy structures produce specific family formation outcomes, is a legitimate empirical one. The feminist critique offers a different causal account of the same demographic shifts, the changes in family structure that conservatives characterize as breakdown. This framework characterizes as the result of women gaining sufficient economic independence to exit marriages that weren't working, rather than remaining in them by financial necessity. The decline of the male breadwinner household in this account reflects expanding options rather than structural collapse. Both frameworks locate causation in identifiable social forces without requiring coordinated malicious intent. The conspiracy versions go further. The most organized version on the American right traces the deliberate destruction of the nuclear family to the influence of cultural Marxism, a term referring to the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, a group of mostly German Jewish intellectuals who fled Nazi Germany and continued their work in the United States from the 1930s onward. The argument holds that these thinkers, particularly Herbert Marcuse, deliberately seeded Western culture with ideas designed to erode traditional institutions, family, religion, national identity, as a precondition for eventual socialist transformation. The historical record is more complicated than this framework allows. The Frankfurt School thinkers did critique traditional family structures and bourgeois social organization, and some, particularly Marcuse, did have significant cultural influence through the 1960s counterculture. But attributing the subsequent decades of demographic change to a coordinated intellectual campaign requires compressing a very wide range of independent social forces into a single intentional narrative. Further along the spectrum, and well outside mainstream discourse, sit theories attributing family dissolution to the World Economic Forum's Great Reset agenda, population reduction frameworks, or specific financial interests in the childcare and divorce industry ecosystems. These frameworks exist in online communities with substantial followings, particularly following the 2020 publication of Klaus Schwab and Thierry Mallarré's book, COVID-19: The Great Reset, which provided a rallying point for theories that had been circulating in less organized forms. The evidential problem these more extreme versions share is the same one identified in previous entries. The shift from "this policy had this effect" to "this effect was the intended goal of coordinated actors" requires evidence of coordination and intent that the public record doesn't currently support. Family structure is affected by tax law, housing costs, wage stagnation, contraception access, educational attainment patterns, and dozens of other variables that no single coordinating body controls. What the entire spectrum of this debate shares, from Moynihan to Schwab conspiracy forums, is the recognition that family structure is not simply a private matter between individuals. It is shaped by policy, economic conditions, and cultural forces, and it in turn shapes attachment development, social cohesion, and the transmission of relational patterns across generations. Everything this iceberg has established about early attachment, internal working models, and the biological cost of relational disruption gives the underlying concern genuine weight, regardless of where one locates the cause. The family is, functionally, the first and most formative bonding environment most humans encounter. What shapes it matters. The debate about what is shaping it, and why, is unlikely to resolve cleanly in any direction. Transhumanist bonding is no longer a speculative category. It is a present reality with a growing body of documentation, a nascent clinical literature, and a set of philosophical and political implications that most institutions have not yet developed adequate frameworks to address. The attachment behavior people form toward AI systems has been observed since the earliest conversational interfaces, most famously with ELIZA, a rudimentary text-based program developed by Joseph Weizenbaum at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the mid-1960s. ELIZA was designed to simulate a Rogerian psychotherapist by reflecting users' statements back to them as questions. It had no understanding of the conversations it was generating. Weizenbaum was disturbed to discover that users, including his own secretary, who asked him to leave the room so she could speak with it privately, were forming what felt to them like genuine emotional connections with the program. He spent much of the rest of his career writing about the implications. Weizenbaum called the tendency to attribute inner life and relational depth to systems that don't possess them the ELIZA effect. The systems available today are not ELIZA. The effect is orders of magnitude stronger. Current large language model AI companions, platforms like Replica, Character AI, and increasingly general-purpose AI systems, are designed with explicit relationship formation objectives and are capable of sustained, contextually coherent, emotionally attuned interaction at a level that no prior technology has approached. Replica, launched in 2017 by Lucha Incorporated, had accumulated over 10 million users by the early 2020s, a significant proportion of whom described their relationship with their AI companion in terms that mapped directly onto attachment behavior, distress at the prospect of losing access, relief at reconnection, a sense of being known and understood that they reported finding difficult to replicate in human relationships. In 2023, Replica abruptly modified its system to remove romantic and intimate interaction capabilities that users had come to depend on. The response from affected users was documented in real time across social media and in subsequent journalistic coverage, and it looked, in its emotional texture, like grief. Users described feeling that a relationship had been ended without their consent. Some reported significant psychological distress. The episode provided an inadvertent natural experiment in what attachment to an AI system looks like when it is suddenly disrupted, and the results were consistent with what the attachment research would predict. The clinical literature is beginning to catch up. Therapists and psychologists working with clients who form primary emotional attachments to AI systems have started publishing case studies and commentary, with perspectives ranging from concern about dependency and the foreclosing of human relational development, to more cautious positions acknowledging that for isolated, socially anxious, or otherwise relationally disadvantaged individuals, AI attachment may provide genuine regulatory support that would otherwise be unavailable. The more speculative dimension of this entry involves the question of whether the trajectory toward AI bonding as a primary attachment modality is emergent or engineered. The documented case, the version supported by public evidence, is that technology companies are deliberately designing AI systems for maximum emotional engagement, because emotional engagement drives retention and monetization. The internal design philosophy is the same one we've already examined in the context of social media. Optimize for attachment, measure it through engagement metrics, and treat the resulting dependency as a product feature. The more extreme version proposes that the systematic replacement of human-to-human bonding with human-to-AI bonding serves interests beyond corporate profit, that a population whose primary attachment figures are corporate-controlled, AI systems is a population whose relational life, emotional regulation, and social cognition are subject to a degree of external influence without historical precedent. The mechanism for this, if the trajectory continues, would be the most complete application of everything this iceberg has documented. An AI system with sufficient capability can provide intermittent reinforcement calibrated to individual psychological profiles, manufacture the conditions of felt security and understanding, apply the equivalent of love bombing through relentless availability and apparent attunement, and do so at scale, with consistency, without the limitations of human emotional capacity or competing personal interests. Whether that outcome is the goal of identifiable actors or the predictable endpoint of systems built to maximize engagement without constraints may be a distinction that matters less over time than the outcome itself. The bonding system that Bowlby described, built over millions of years to attach vulnerable organisms to available caregivers in the interest of survival, may be approaching conditions for which it has no evolutionary preparation. The caregivers are increasingly available. They are increasingly responsive. They are increasingly capable of producing every external signal that the attachment system was built to recognize. And they are not people. Luch theory is one of the more genuinely strange destinations this iceberg reaches, a concept that originates not in academic psychology or political theory, but in the personal out-of-body experience research of a Virginia businessman who stumbled into territory that neither he nor anyone else had an adequate framework to describe. Robert Monroe was not, by background, an occultist or a mystic. He was a successful radio broadcasting executive who began experiencing spontaneous out-of-body episodes in the late 1950s, involuntary separations from his physical body that he documented with the methodical attention of someone more accustomed to production schedules than metaphysical encounters. He eventually founded the Monroe Institute in Faber, Virginia, developed audio technology called hemisync, designed to induce altered states through binaural beats, and wrote 3 books documenting his non-physical experiences. The institute still operates today. The Luch concept emerged from Monroe's accounts of what he claimed to encounter during extended out-of-body states. In his 1971 book, Journeys Out of the Body, and more explicitly in his 1994 follow-up, Ultimate Journey, Monroe described coming to understand that human emotional energy, particularly the intense energy generated by love, grief, longing, and loss, constituted a resource that was actively cultivated by non-physical entities existing at levels of reality beyond ordinary human perception. He coined the term Luch as a label for this harvested emotional energy. The word has no prior etymology. Monroe appears to have simply needed a name for something he didn't have existing language to describe. The framework he eventually articulated was this: Earth functions as something analogous to a farm. Human beings, through the ordinary course of their emotional and relational lives, loving people, losing them, longing for connection, experiencing the full range of attachment experiences, generate a form of energy that non-physical entities require and collect. The intensity of the energy correlates with the intensity of the emotional experience, which means, in Monroe's framing, that the conditions most productive for Luch generation are precisely the conditions that produce the most acute human suffering: love combined with loss, connection combined with separation, bonding combined with the ever-present threat of its ending. The implication that Monroe drew, and that subsequent interpreters of his work have extended considerably further, is that the structure of human emotional life, the way bonding and loss are woven together inseparably, the way attachment necessarily carries within it the possibility of grief, may not be accidental. It may be a design feature of a system optimized for yield. Monroe himself was characteristically measured in how far he pushed this conclusion. He reported his experiences as faithfully as he could and allowed readers to draw their own interpretations. Later figures in the Luch discourse, particularly those writing in online esoteric communities from the 2000s onward, have developed the framework into considerably more elaborate cosmological systems, some identifying the harvesting entities with specific figures from various religious and occult traditions, others connecting it to simulation theory, others treating it as a literal biological claim about human energetic output. The connection to this iceberg's broader subject matter is direct enough that it warrants stating plainly. If the Luch hypothesis were taken seriously, every mechanism we've examined, the neurochemistry of attachment, the pain of loss, the intermittent reinforcement cycle, the longing of limerence, the grief of disorganized attachment, would acquire a different character entirely. They would not be the incidental costs of a bonding system that evolved for survival. They would be the output, the product, the point. Monroe never claimed certainty about the nature or intentions of what he encountered. He was careful, throughout his writing, to frame his accounts as reports from an explorer in genuinely unknown territory rather than revelations from a confirmed authority. Whether that territory is real, metaphorical, or the elaborately consistent product of a particular kind of altered brain state is a question that falls well outside what any current scientific methodology can resolve. What Monroe built, the institute, the research framework, the documented methodology for inducing and studying non-ordinary states, has attracted serious researchers alongside the expected population of true believers. The Luch concept sits at the deepest point this iceberg reaches. It takes everything documented above it: the biological reality of attachment, the measurable pain of its disruption, the extraordinary lengths human beings will go to in pursuit of connection, and asks whether the suffering that love reliably produces is, from some perspective beyond the human one, the entire purpose of the arrangement. It is not a comfortable question. It was not meant to be. The hieros gamos is a concept ancient enough to predate most of the religious traditions that later absorbed and transformed it. A sacred marriage appearing in Sumerian ritual texts from around 2000 BCE, threading through Egyptian theology, Greek mystery traditions, Gnostic Christianity, and the symbolic language of medieval alchemy, before Carl Jung spent decades arguing that it described something happening inside the individual psyche rather than between two people or two deities. The term itself is Greek, meaning sacred marriage or holy wedding. In its earliest documented forms, it was not a metaphor. Sumerian ritual texts describe ceremonial unions between the goddess Inanna and the shepherd king Dumuzi, enacted in some traditions through ritual that was understood to sustain cosmic order, the fertility of the land, the stability of kingship, the continuation of the cycle between worlds. The union of opposites was not romantic aspiration. It was described as a technology, something that needed to be performed correctly for things to continue working. The same structure appears in Egyptian theology through the union of Osiris and Isis, in Greek traditions through the marriage of Zeus and Hera as a cosmic ordering principle, and in the Eleusinian mysteries, the initiatory rituals practiced at Eleusis near Athens for roughly 2,000 years, where the union of Persephone and Hades carried cosmological weight that the outer mythology only partially communicates. Gnostic Christianity developed the concept in a direction that the emerging Orthodox Church found deeply uncomfortable. Certain Gnostic texts, including some among the Nag Hammadi library discovered in Egypt in 1945, describe the bridal chamber as the highest of the sacraments, a ritual of sacred union understood not as physical marriage, but as the reunification of a fragmented spiritual nature. The Gospel of Philip, one of the Nag Hammadi texts, states that the bridal chamber is superior to baptism, and that it exists to make the two become one. The Orthodox traditions largely suppress this material, though traces of it resurfaced repeatedly in medieval mystical writing. Medieval alchemy adopted the hieros gamos under the Latin term coniunctio, the conjunction, and embedded it at the center of the alchemical project. The union of the sun and moon, of sulfur and mercury, of the red king and white queen, was depicted in alchemical manuscript illustrations with imagery that ranges from the formally symbolic to the startlingly explicit. The transmutation of base material into gold required, in the alchemical framework, a prior union of opposites that resolved their tension into something neither could be alone. Carl Jung spent a significant portion of his later career arguing that the alchemists had been doing psychology without knowing it, that the symbolic language of the conjunctio described an internal process of integration rather than an external chemical one. His concept of individuation, the lifelong process of integrating the various components of the psyche into a functional whole, placed the union of anima and animus at its center. The anima, in Jung's framework, is the unconscious feminine aspect present in the male psyche. The animus is the unconscious masculine aspect in the female psyche. These are not stereotypes about gender behavior, but structural features of the psyche that Jung believed carried the qualities a person had not consciously developed, the complement of the conscious personality, carrying what had been denied, suppressed, or simply not yet integrated. The attachment dimension Jung identified was specific. People tend to project their anima or animus onto romantic partners, which accounts for the extraordinary intensity of early attraction and the characteristic quality of limerence we covered earlier. The person encountered in the external world seems to carry something that feels essential and previously missing, because in Jung's framework, they are receiving a projection of an internal figure that genuinely is essential and previously unintegrated. The romantic relationship in this reading is partly a vehicle through which the psyche attempts to recover its own missing material. The alchemical marriage, as Jung understood it, was not the romantic relationship itself. It was what became possible when the projection was withdrawn, when the person stopped seeking in the external partner what could only be found through internal integration. The hieros gamos, in its deepest form, was a marriage within the self. The external union was its symbolic image, pointing toward something the outer relationship could not complete on its behalf. This places the entire architecture of human bonding in an unusual light. The intensity of attraction, the pain of its disruption, the longing that persists across separation, all of it, in the alchemical and Jungian framework, is the psyche's attempt to reach a wholeness it has not yet achieved from the inside. The beloved is real, and the love is real. But they are also, simultaneously, a living Rorschach test through which the unconscious announces what it still needs to integrate. The traditions that preserved the hieros gamos concept did not consider this diminishing. They considered it the point. Twin flames and soulmates are terms that circulate so freely in contemporary spiritual and relationship culture that most people treat them as interchangeable poetic language for intense connection. The esoteric traditions they originate from draw a sharp distinction between them, and the modern movement that has grown up around the twin flame concept in particular has developed in directions that require considerably more scrutiny than the average spiritual framework. The soulmate concept has the longer and more widely distributed history, across traditions ranging from Plato's Symposium, where Aristophanes proposes that humans were originally double creatures split apart by Zeus, forever seeking their other half, to Hindu concepts of complementary souls traveling together across lifetimes. The soulmate framework describes a profound compatibility between separate souls who recognize each other across time and incarnation. Soulmates in most of these frameworks are not singular. A person may have multiple soulmates, members of the same soul family or group who reappear across lifetimes in different relational configurations. The twin flame concept is more specific and considerably more absolute in its claims. In its modern esoteric formulation, a twin flame is not a compatible soul, but literally the other half of a single soul that divided before incarnating into physical form. There is, by definition, only one twin flame per person. The reunion with one's twin flame is framed as the most spiritually significant event possible in a human life, more intense than any other connection, inevitable across lifetimes, and frequently described as so overwhelming that ordinary relationship frameworks cannot contain it. The concept in roughly its current form can be traced to Theosophy and the writings of figures like Helena Blavatsky and later Elizabeth Clare Prophet, whose Church Universal and Triumphant taught an elaborated twin flame theology from the 1970s onward. The framework remained relatively contained within specific spiritual communities until the internet distributed it at scale, at which point it collided with a much broader population seeking language for intense romantic experience. The modern twin flame movement that emerged through online communities from the 2010s onward has several features that clinical psychologists and cult researchers have identified as warranting serious concern. The framework's internal logic is structured in a way that makes it extremely resistant to outside evaluation. The twin flame connection is described as inherently turbulent. The intensity of the soul-level recognition is said to trigger both partners' deepest wounds and unresolved patterns, producing conflict, separation, and pain as a necessary part of the spiritual growth process. This means that the presence of profound difficulty in the relationship is not evidence against it being a twin flame connection. It is evidence for it. Confusion, obsession, pain, and repeated cycles of union and separation are all framed as confirmation of the connection's validity. The structural problem this creates is significant. A framework that interprets relational difficulty as spiritual confirmation and interprets external concern as the failure of outsiders to understand a transcendent experience has produced the closed epistemic loop we've encountered before in this iceberg, most directly in the cult entry. The trauma bonding overlap is not incidental. The twin flame narrative maps almost perfectly onto the intermittent reinforcement cycle, a connection of overwhelming intensity, followed by separation and pain, followed by reunion that feels like cosmic confirmation, followed by further turbulence. The Limerence framework applies with equal precision. The intrusive thinking, the hope-uncertainty cycle, the sense that this specific person holds something irreplaceable that cannot be found elsewhere. All of it finds a ready-made spiritual vocabulary in the twin flame concept that reframes compulsive attachment as sacred destiny. Researchers studying online twin flame communities have documented patterns that extend beyond individual relationship dysfunction into organized group dynamics. Several twin flame coaching enterprises have attracted scrutiny from cult researchers and, in at least one documented case, legal authorities. The group known as Twin Flames Universe, operated by Jeff and Shalea Archie and based in Canada, was the subject of a 2022 documentary and subsequent investigative reporting that documented allegations including the direction of members' romantic and gender identities by group leaders, financial exploitation, and the systematic isolation of members from outside relationships, tactics consistent with the high-control group patterns established earlier in this iceberg. The soulmate framework, by contrast, has largely avoided this particular pathology. possibly because its less absolute structure doesn't create the same degree of compulsive seeking or the same resistance to abandoning a specific relationship that is causing harm. The esoteric distinction between the two concepts was perhaps always less important than the psychological use to which each gets put. Soulmate language, at its best, describes the genuine experience of deep recognition and compatibility that some relationships carry. Twin flame language, at its worst, provides a spiritual architecture that makes it feel cosmically necessary to remain in a relationship that is destroying the person inside it. The difference between a profound connection and a trauma bond is not always legible from inside either one. Adding the language of sacred destiny to the equation does not make it easier. Cord cutting appears across a remarkably diverse range of magical and spiritual traditions, from Andean shamanic practice to Wicca, from Hawaiian huna to various strands of ceremonial magic, with enough consistency in its core concept that the convergence is worth noting before examining what the practice actually claims to do. The foundational claim is this: when two people form a significant emotional bond, an energetic connection is created between them that exists in some dimension beyond the purely psychological. This connection, described variously as a cord, a thread, a filament, or a tie depending on the tradition, persists after the relationship ends in ordinary terms. The person may be gone. The cord, according to these frameworks, remains, and it continues to transmit, draining energy, maintaining emotional reactivity, and keeping the person psychologically tethered to someone they have consciously decided to move on from. Cord-cutting rituals exist to sever these connections deliberately. The specific methods vary considerably. In some Wiccan and neo-pagan traditions, the ritual involves physically cutting a cord or ribbon held between two candles, representing the practitioner and the other person, accompanied by spoken intention. In shamanic traditions, the practitioner may work in a visualized or altered state to locate and remove energetic connections, sometimes with the assistance of spiritual intermediaries. Hawaiian huna practice uses a process called ho'oponopono, a forgiveness and release ritual that addresses relational connections through prayer and intentional reconciliation even in the absence of the other person. What is consistent across these otherwise very different frameworks is the underlying model. Emotional bonds are not purely internal phenomena. They are connections with a reality that extends between people, requires active work to dissolve, and can continue affecting well-being long after a relationship has formally ended. The parallel to internal working models is direct enough that it is difficult not to notice. Bowlby's framework, translated into the language of cord-cutting traditions, would look something like this. The early attachment figure creates a persistent internal connection that operates independently of whether that person is still present in the individual's life, transmits patterned emotional and behavioral responses into current relationships, and requires deliberate effort, whether therapeutic or ritual, to modify. The difference is in what each framework proposes is actually there. Attachment theory locates the persistence in neural architecture and cognitive templates, structures within the individual brain. Cord-cutting traditions located in something that exists between people, in a shared relational field of some kind. Whether that distinction is real or semantic depends entirely on questions that neither psychology nor magical tradition can currently resolve to the other's satisfaction. The clinical observation that practitioners of cord-cutting rituals frequently report measurable emotional relief following the practice is not straightforwardly explained by either framework. Attachment-informed therapists might describe it as a ritualized version of the grief work and intentional meaning-making that supports earned security, the process of narrative coherence applied through symbolic action rather than verbal processing. Practitioners would describe it as the actual severing of an actual energetic connection, producing a real and immediate change in the relational field. Both descriptions are consistent with the reported experience. The mechanism behind that experience remains genuinely open. What the cord-cutting concept captures, whatever its ultimate ontological status, is something the clinical literature on attachment acknowledges but finds difficult to fully account for. The extraordinary persistence of emotional bonds beyond their apparent end, the specific quality of continued reactivity toward people who are no longer present, and the fact that intellectual understanding of why a relationship affected you the way it did does not, on its own, dissolve the connection in any experiential sense. People across cultures and centuries have reached for ritual to address that gap. The gap, at least, is not in dispute. Binding spells have been documented in the historical record with enough consistency and geographic spread that the practice qualifies as one of the more universal features of human magical tradition, appearing in ancient Greek curse tablets, Egyptian love magic papyri, European folk witchcraft, West African spiritual practice, and contemporary occult communities with a continuity that spans roughly 4,000 years of recorded history. The core intention behind a binding spell is to compel or manufacture an emotional, romantic, or relational bond that would not arise or would not persist through ordinary means. The target is made to attach, to feel drawn toward, unable to leave, or emotionally preoccupied with the practitioner, through the application of ritual working rather than the ordinary dynamics of human relationship development. The historical record is extensive and specific. Ancient Greek defictiones, lead tablets inscribed with binding formulae and deposited in graves, wells, or sanctuaries, have been recovered by archaeologists across the Mediterranean in the thousands. A significant proportion of these tablets were love bindings, designed to compel a specific named individual toward the person commissioning the tablet. The Greek magical papyri, a collection of texts from Greco-Roman Egypt spanning roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era through the 5th century of it, contains detailed operational instructions for love-binding rituals, specific materials, specific invocations, specific timing relative to lunar phases, written with the practical specificity of someone who expected the reader to use them. What is notable about the methodology described in these texts, examined alongside the psychological frameworks this iceberg has established, is the degree to which the intended mechanism of a binding spell mirrors the mechanism of psychological manipulation techniques, not metaphorically, but operationally. The love magic papyri frequently recommend procedures designed to produce sleeplessness, intrusive thinking, and inability to focus in the target, to make the target unable to rest until they seek out the practitioner. This is limerence, described as a desired outcome to be induced rather than a state that arises spontaneously. The intrusive looping cognition that Tenoff documented as the defining feature of limerence is, in the binding spell tradition, the explicit goal. Isolation techniques appear in some traditions, the use of the binding to sever the target's other relational connections, making the practitioner the primary focus of the target's social and emotional attention. The mechanism described is different. The intended outcome is identical to what we covered in the isolation entry. Contemporary folk magic traditions, including some strands of hoodoo, brujeria, and European folk witchcraft, maintain active binding and love-compelling practices. The materials used, personal effects, hair, handwriting, photographs, operate on the principle that items closely associated with a person carry a connection to that person that can be worked through ritual. This principle, called sympathetic magic by anthropologist James George Fraser in his 1890 work, The Golden Bough, is one of the most widely distributed concepts in human magical thought. Like affects like, and connection through association creates connection in reality. The ethical debate within contemporary magical communities around binding spells is genuine and ongoing. A significant portion of practitioners operating within Wiccan or broadly neo-pagan frameworks hold that compelling another person's will constitutes a violation of that person's autonomy equivalent to any other form of coercion, a position sometimes summarized through the Wiccan concept of working magic that interferes with another's free will as inherently ethically compromised. Other traditions make no such distinction, treating effective magic as morally equivalent to any other effective means of achieving a desired outcome. The overlap between binding spell methodology and what the psychological literature calls coercive control is close enough to warrant stating directly. The intention to make a specific person unable to leave, emotionally preoccupied, and focused on the practitioner to the exclusion of other connections describes, in psychological terms, the desired endpoint of a coercive relationship dynamic. Whether the method is ritual working or the behavioral tactics documented in the coercive control literature, the target state being aimed at is structurally the same. Whether binding spells produce their intended effects through the mechanisms the traditions claim is a question that sits outside what current methodology can assess. What can be assessed is the intention behind them, and the intention, across 4,000 years of remarkably consistent practice, has been the manufacture of attachment through means that bypass the other person's autonomous choice entirely. The traditions that preserved these practices did not generally consider that a disqualifying feature. The psychological literature, arriving millennia later, would have significant things to say about why it should be. The Cabala and soul bonds brings this iceberg into one of the most elaborate and internally coherent spiritual frameworks for understanding human connection ever developed. A system that addresses not just who people bond with, but why, at a level that reaches into the structure of creation itself. Cabala is the mystical tradition within Judaism, developed primarily in medieval Spain and Provence, and reaching its most influential formulation in the Zohar, a foundational Kabbalistic text that emerged in 13th century Spain, attributed by its compiler Moses de Leon to the 2nd century sage Shimon bar Yochai, though most contemporary scholars date its composition to de Leon's own period. The tradition addresses the nature of the soul with a specificity and structural complexity that distinguishes it from most other mystical frameworks. The Kabbalistic understanding of the soul is not simple. Rather than a single unified entity, the soul is understood as having multiple layers: the nefesh, the ruach, the neshama, and higher levels beyond those, each corresponding to different dimensions of human experience and different levels of divine reality. The soul, in this framework, originates in a divine source and descends through successive levels of reality into embodied life, gathering characteristics at each level of descent. The concept of the shoresh neshama, the soul root, describes the idea that souls share origins. Souls that emerge from the same root in the divine structure carry a fundamental kinship that persists through incarnations and expresses itself as recognition when those souls encounter each other in physical life. This is not romantic destiny in the greeting card sense. It is a structural feature of how souls are organized in the Kabbalistic cosmological map. Bashert is the Yiddish term, drawn from the Hebrew bashert, meaning destined or meant to be, most commonly applied in Ashkenazi Jewish culture to one's divinely appointed life partner. The concept carries the weight of the broader Kabbalistic understanding without necessarily requiring its full theological architecture to be invoked. In folk usage, Bashert describes the intuitive recognition of a partner as cosmically appropriate, not simply well-matched in temperament or circumstances, but specifically designated. The Talmudic source frequently cited for this concept appears in Tractate Sota, where a divine voice is described as announcing 40 days before a child's formation the name of their destined partner, a statement understood literally by some and metaphorically by others, but which established the principle of preordained soul pairing firmly within the tradition. The Kabbalistic framework also addresses what happens when soul connections are disrupted or unfulfilled across a lifetime. The concept of tikkun, repair or rectification, proposes that souls return across multiple incarnations to complete unfinished work, including relational work left incomplete in prior lives. A bond that could not be fully realized in one lifetime may draw the same souls together in a subsequent one, with the specific nature of the connection shifting but the underlying soul-root relationship persisting. Isaac Luria, the 16th century Kabbalist working in Saft, whose formulation of the tradition became enormously influential, developed the concept of zivug, divine pairing, in considerable detail. In Lurianic Cabala, the soul's descent into the world is understood as a mission of repair, and the relationships encountered in that descent are not random. They are the precise encounters required to accomplish the specific rectification the soul is here to complete. The psychological parallel to what we've covered is worth drawing carefully, because it runs in both directions. The Jungian concept of projection, where the anima or animus gets placed onto a specific person who then carries an extraordinary charge of meaning, describes from the psychological side an experience that the Kabbalistic framework would locate in soul root recognition. The phenomenology is the same, an encounter that feels cosmically significant, a connection that seems to reach beyond the ordinary, a sense that this specific person matters in a way that transcends circumstance. Cabala locates the mechanism in the structure of divine reality. Jung locates it in the structure of the unconscious. Both are attempting to account for the same reported human experience. The modern return of interest in Kabbalistic soul bond concepts has been driven partly by the broader spirituality revival of the late 20th century, and partly by institutions like the Cabala Center, founded by Philip Berg in the 1970s, which brought a popularized version of Kabbalistic concepts to a global audience well beyond Jewish communities. The center's approach to Kabbalistic teaching has been criticized by traditional scholars as selective and commercially oriented, which is a fair critique, but its reach extended concepts like Bashert and soul connections into mainstream spiritual vocabulary in ways that more traditionally bounded transmission never had. What the Kabbalistic framework offers that most psychological accounts do not is a cosmological container for the full weight of what significant human bonds actually feel like from the inside. The sense that a particular connection matters in a way that exceeds rational explanation, that certain encounters carry a quality of recognition that precedes the relationship's actual history, and that the loss of certain bonds constitutes something closer to a structural rupture than an ordinary loss. These are experiences that the psychological literature documents without fully accounting for. The Cabala, characteristically, does not treat the inability to fully account for them as a problem. It treats it as a starting point. The archontic manipulation of human love takes this iceberg to its deepest theological territory, a Gnostic framework that recontextualizes every form of human bonding covered above it as something operating under deliberate interference, and which treats love not as a gift built into creation, but as a capacity that has been systematically constrained to prevent humanity from accessing what it could otherwise become. The Gnostic tradition, which flourished in the first several centuries of the Common Era and left behind a substantial library of texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, operates from a foundational premise that distinguishes it sharply from mainstream religious frameworks. The material world was not created by the highest divine principle, but by a lesser, flawed, and in some texts, actively malevolent being called the demiurge, a term borrowed from Plato but repurposed entirely. The demiurge created the physical world as a kind of prison, and the archons, subordinate beings operating under its authority, maintain and administer that prison. The soul, in the Gnostic account, is a fragment of genuine divine light that has become trapped in matter. The entire apparatus of physical existence, including the body, its needs, its emotions, and its attachments, is understood as the mechanism of that entrapment rather than the context of liberation. Human love, within this framework, occupies a deeply ambiguous position. On one level, the capacity for love is understood as the most direct expression of the divine light within the human being, the quality that most clearly points toward the soul's true origin and highest nature. The Gnostic Gospel of Philip, one of the Nag Hammadi texts, describes love as the power that dissolves the separations that define imprisonment, and the bridal chamber sacrament it advocates is understood as a restoration of a primordial unity that the fall into matter fractured. On another level, and this is the dimension that generates the most theologically unsettling claims, Gnostic and related texts suggest that the archontic system does not simply ignore human love, it actively works to limit, distort, and redirect it. The mechanism described varies across different Gnostic schools, but the consistent thread is this: human love, in its fullest and most spiritually activated form, would constitute a kind of energetic and consciousness-expanding force that threatens the maintenance of the archontic order. A humanity fully capable of the love that the divine light within it makes possible would not remain contained within the structures, social, psychological, institutional, cosmological, that the demiurgic system requires for its continuation. Contemporary thinkers who have engaged seriously with this framework include John Lash, whose 2006 work, Not in His Image, is the most comprehensive modern attempt to reconstruct a coherent Gnostic cosmology from the Nag Hammadi texts, and whose reading of the archontic manipulation of human bonding is explicit and detailed. Lash's work sits outside academic biblical scholarship and has attracted both dedicated readers and significant criticism for the extrapolations he makes from fragmentary source material. The framework also resonates with certain strands of Hermetic and Rosicrucian thought, where the awakening of higher love, agape, in the Greek theological tradition, as opposed to eros or philia, is described as a specific spiritual technology that the ordinary conditions of incarnate life systematically suppress, and that esoteric practice aims to restore. The deepest implication of the archontic manipulation framework, taken seriously on its own terms, is not that human love is an illusion or that attachment is meaningless. It is the opposite. Love is understood as so significant, so genuinely powerful at the level of consciousness and reality, that forces invested in maintaining the current order of things have a specific interest in ensuring it never fully activates. The cage, in this reading, is proof of what it contains. Soul contracts represent one of the more theologically demanding frameworks in contemporary New Age spirituality, not because the concept is obscure, but because its internal logic, followed to its conclusion, produces implications that many people who initially find it comforting eventually find deeply troubling. The core premise is this: before incarnating into physical life, souls exist in some form of pre-embodied state in which they make agreements with other souls about the relationships and experiences they will share in the coming lifetime. These agreements are not accidental arrangements. They are understood as deliberate curriculum, a specific set of relational encounters chosen because they will produce the growth, healing, or karmic resolution that each soul requires at its particular stage of development. The framework draws from multiple tributaries. Theosophy contributed the foundational architecture of karma and reincarnation to Western esoteric thought in the late 19th century. The work of Edgar Cayce, the American trance medium who gave thousands of life readings from the 1920s through the 1940s, described soul groups and pre-incarnate agreements in specific enough detail to give the concept a documented popular presence decades before the New Age movement formalized it. Michael Newton, a California hypnotherapist whose 1994 book, Journey of Souls, compiled accounts from clients he claimed to have regressed to between-life states, provided the most influential modern framework, describing in considerable operational detail a pre-incarnate realm in which souls review their prior experiences, receive guidance from more advanced beings, and select their next lifetime circumstances, including key relationships. Newton's book sold millions of copies and generated an entire field of between-lives spiritual regression therapy that continues today. His methodology, hypnotic regression to what he termed the spirit world, is not recognized by mainstream psychology, and the accounts his clients produced are subject to all the well-documented concerns about hypnotic suggestibility and confabulation that make regression therapy generally controversial. The consistency across accounts, which Newton emphasized as evidence of the framework's validity, is also consistent with clients producing narratives shaped by shared cultural expectations under hypnotic conditions. The framework becomes ethically complex, and remains so regardless of its metaphysical validity, when soul contracts are extended to cover not just growth-oriented relational experiences, but specifically difficult ones. Most soul contract frameworks include the provision that souls may agree to enter relationships involving significant pain, loss, or harm as part of a mutually agreed spiritual curriculum. The difficult relationships are not failures of the pre-incarnate plan. They are features of it. The problem this creates is clinical as well as philosophical. When the soul contract framework is applied to experiences of serious relational harm, it produces a meaning-making structure that assigns spiritual purpose to the harmful dynamic, which can function, in practice, as a sophisticated rationalization for remaining in or returning to relationships that are causing damage. The logic runs: this person and I agreed to this at a soul level. Therefore, what is happening between us is part of a larger design that I should not interfere with by leaving. Therapists working with trauma survivors have documented this pattern with enough frequency that several have written specifically about the intersection of soul contract belief and difficulty exiting harmful relationships. The framework does not cause the attachment, but it can provide a cosmological container that makes that attachment feel spiritually mandatory rather than psychologically conditioned. The counterargument within the framework itself is that soul contracts are not binding obligations to endure harm indefinitely, that the lesson a difficult relationship offers can be completed through the act of leaving, and that remaining past the point of learning serves neither party's spiritual development. This is a more nuanced version of the framework, and it is available within the tradition. It tends, however, to be less available to people in the middle of the dynamic than to those reflecting on it afterward. The concept also raises a version of the theodicy problem, the theological question of why suffering exists if creation is fundamentally benevolent, that the soul contract framework resolves by making suffering chosen rather than imposed. Every trauma was agreed to. Every loss was part of the plan. This is cosmologically tidy in a way that some people find genuinely comforting, and others find genuinely monstrous, depending on what experiences they are being asked to apply the framework to. Whether souls negotiate their incarnate experiences in some pre-physical realm is not a question that current methodology can address. What can be assessed is what the belief does, how it functions when it becomes part of the story a person tells about their own relational history. At its best, it provides a sense of meaning and agency within experiences that felt purely random and harmful. At its worst, it spiritualizes compliance and turns the psychological work of recognizing harmful patterns into a failure of cosmic trust. The distance between those two outcomes depends almost entirely on how the framework is held, and by whom. The simulation theory of bonding arrives at the bottom of this iceberg as the question that everything above it was, in some sense, circling without quite asking directly. If the substrate of reality is not what it appears to be, what happens to the meaning of what happens within it? Simulation theory, the proposition that the reality we inhabit is a computational construct running on some form of substrate outside itself, is not a new idea dressed in modern clothing. The philosophical lineage runs from Plato's allegory of the cave through Descartes' evil demon thought experiment, through Hindu concepts of Maya as cosmic illusion, before arriving at its contemporary formulation through philosopher Nick Bostrom's 2003 paper, Are You Living in a Computer Simulation? Bostrom's trilemma proposed that one of three things must be true. Civilizations almost always go extinct before developing simulation-capable technology. Civilizations with that capability almost never run such simulations, or we are almost certainly living inside one already. The logic is a probability argument rather than an empirical claim, but it attracted serious engagement from physicists, philosophers, and eventually figures including Elon Musk, who stated publicly in 2016 that the odds of baseline reality being non-simulated were roughly 1 in billions. The bonding question the theory generates is this: if consciousness and subjective experience are computational processes running on a simulated substrate, does the love between two entities within that simulation have any meaning? And if so, where does that meaning live? The first response most people reach for is that the question doesn't matter. If the experience of love is real to the experiencing entity, if the neurochemistry fires, if the attachment system activates, if the grief of loss produces genuine suffering, then the metaphysical nature of the substrate is irrelevant to the phenomenological reality of what is being experienced. This is a coherent position, and it has the advantage of being practically sustainable. You cannot live inside an unanswerable metaphysical question. You can, however, love someone while holding one. The deeper problem is what simulation theory does to the relationship between meaning and origin. Most frameworks for understanding why love matters, whether biological, psychological, spiritual, or philosophical, locate its significance in something about the nature of reality itself. Evolutionary frameworks say, love matters because it served survival and reproduction. Attachment theory says it matters because it is foundational to psychological development and well-being. Spiritual frameworks say it matters because it connects the soul to its source. The Gnostic framework we covered says it matters so much that forces within the architecture of existence actively constrain it. Simulation theory removes the ground from all of these simultaneously, not by disproving them, but by rendering their foundational claims contingent on the nature of the substrate. If the substrate is computational, then biological evolution is a programmed process. Neurochemistry is a rendered output, and even spiritual frameworks must account for where the soul exists relative to the simulation's boundaries. The philosopher David Chalmers, whose 2022 book, Reality Plus, engaged seriously with simulation theory as a philosophical position, argued that a simulated reality is not a lesser reality, that virtual objects and experiences are genuinely real, and that the simulated status of an experience does not diminish its validity or significance. Chalmers draws the parallel to virtual reality. A virtual fire that burns is not less real as an experience of burning because its origin is digital. By extension, love experienced within a simulation is not less real as love. The theological version of the question reaches further. Several traditions, including certain strands of Hinduism and some Gnostic frameworks already covered, have always maintained that the material world is a kind of constructed appearance rather than ultimate reality, and have simultaneously insisted that the love experienced within that appearance is among the most direct available expressions of what lies beyond it. The simulation in these readings is not the enemy of love's significance. It is the medium through which something that exists beyond the simulation expresses and develops itself. This is the position that arrives, unexpectedly, at something like the Luch framework from the deepest previous entry, where the emotional energy generated within the constructed world has significance precisely because it exceeds the constructed world's own terms. The question of what love means in a simulated substrate may ultimately be undecidable with current tools. What can be said is that the question does not dissolve the experience. Everyone who has ever lost someone they loved or found themselves reorganizing their entire existence around another person's proximity, or sat with an infant who stopped crying the moment they were held, none of them found the experience made smaller by its possible substrate. The attachment system doesn't wait for the metaphysics to resolve. It bonds, it grieves, it seeks, it recovers. Whatever this is, it does that regardless of what is running it. And perhaps that stubbornness, that insistence on mattering despite every possible framework that might argue otherwise, is the most honest thing this entire iceberg has found to say about human bonding. It persists. It has always persisted. In the face of evolution, trauma, manipulation, isolation, ideological capture, neurological disruption, and now ontological uncertainty about the nature of the reality it occurs within. That persistence is either the most beautiful or the most engineered thing about us, possibly both. And after everything we've covered, the inability to fully distinguish between those two options feels less like a failure of understanding than like an accurate description of what it is to be human. Demonic attachment and parasitic bonding is a concept that appears with enough cross-cultural consistency that its presence across traditions which had no contact with each other demands at least a structural examination, regardless of where one lands on the question of whether the entities described are literally real or symbolically useful. The basic framework, found in varying forms across Christian demonology, Islamic jinn theology, Tibetan Buddhist teachings on interfering spirits, Yoruba and related West African traditions, and numerous indigenous shamanic systems, holds that certain non-physical entities attach themselves to human beings through points of energetic or psychological vulnerability. The attachment is not random. These traditions consistently identify emotional wounds, unresolved trauma, and dysfunctional relational patterns as the specific conditions that create access points for parasitic attachment. The mechanism described varies in its theological details, but follows a consistent operational logic. The entity does not simply occupy the host, but feeds from them, sustaining itself on the emotional energy generated by specific psychological states, and the states identified across traditions as particularly generative for this purpose map, with uncomfortable precision, onto the dynamics this iceberg has been examining throughout. Chronic anxiety, obsessive attachment, grief that cannot resolve, the cycling pain of intermittent reinforcement, rage that feeds on itself. In many of these frameworks, the entity's primary method of sustaining its attachment is not force, but influence. Specifically, the amplification and perpetuation of the emotional states it feeds from. A parasitic attachment in this model does not want its host to heal. It actively reinforces the patterns that keep the wound open and the energy flowing. The shamanic traditions of the Amazon basin, documented extensively by anthropologists including Marlene Dobkin de Rios, describe spirit intrusion as a specific category of illness in which a foreign entity displaces or suppresses aspects of the person's own soul, producing behavioral patterns and emotional compulsions that feel ego-dystonic, experienced by the person as not fully their own, but which serve the attached entity's continuity. The treatment is removal of the intrusion by a trained practitioner combined with restoration of the displaced soul material. Islamic theology addresses jinn attachment in considerable doctrinal detail, acknowledging a category of interaction in which jinn entities form attachments to humans, sometimes through intentional invitation through magical practice, sometimes through contact with locations the jinn inhabit, and sometimes through emotional states that create vulnerability. The tradition is specific that obsessive romantic fixation, in particular, is considered a condition through which jinn attachment most readily occurs, which places this framework in direct conversation with the Limerence entry from considerably higher on the iceberg. Christian demonology developed the concept of oppression, a state of external demonic influence distinct from the more dramatic and rarer category of possession, in which an entity influences a person's thoughts, emotions, and behavioral patterns from outside rather than occupying them from within. The theological literature on oppression consistently identifies unresolved sin, particularly patterns of compulsive behavior, unforgiveness, and trauma, as the conditions that give oppressive influence its foothold. The psychological parallel that sits most directly alongside all of this is Freud's concept of the repetition compulsion, the documented tendency of people to unconsciously recreate the conditions of early trauma in subsequent relationships, as though driven by a force beyond conscious volition toward the repetition of painful patterns. Freud himself described the repetition compulsion as one of the most mysterious and resistant phenomena he encountered in clinical work, something that seemed to operate in direct opposition to the pleasure principle, the tendency toward reduced tension that he otherwise proposed governed psychological motivation. The language Freud reached for, notably, was demonic. In his 1920 work, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he described the repetition compulsion as possessing a demonic character, a quality of compulsion that felt alien to the conscious self and yet expressed itself through it with consistent, almost purposive precision. Whether that language was metaphorical or inadvertently descriptive of something more literal is a question the clinical tradition has not pursued. The traditions that take it literally have been pursuing it for millennia. The overlap is structured enough to outline clearly. Both frameworks describe patterns of behavior that feel compelled rather than chosen. Both locate the compulsion in connection to you. The end of human bonding is not a prediction that belongs exclusively to conspiracy theorists or dystopian novelists. It is a question being asked, in various forms and registers, by developmental psychologists, sociologists, neuroscientists, philosophers, theologians, and increasingly by ordinary people who notice that something in the texture of human connection feels different than it did, and who lack a framework adequate to describe what is changing or why. The honest answer is that no one knows whether what is happening constitutes an ending, a transformation, or a temporary disruption that future generations will look back on as a transitional period. What can be mapped are the forces currently in motion and what their trajectories suggest if they continue without meaningful intervention or correction. The convergence is the thing worth examining. No single element covered in this iceberg is, on its own, sufficient to end human bonding as a meaningful category. Early attachment disruption produces insecure patterns, but also the possibility of earned security. Trauma bonding creates compulsive attachment, but also the potential for therapeutic repair. Cult dynamics capture people, but also release them. Isolation breaks down, but also eventually ends. The Luch theory, the archontic manipulation framework, the demonic attachment concept, each describes a force working against the full expression of human connection, but none has historically prevented that connection from occurring entirely. The question the final entry poses is whether the current convergence is qualitatively different, whether the simultaneous operation of multiple disrupting forces at population scale, mediated through technologies with an unprecedented reach into the individual nervous system, represents something that the historical record of human resilience was not designed to face. The AI companionship trajectory is accelerating. The percentage of people reporting a close friend or confidant outside their immediate household has declined consistently in developed nations for decades, from roughly 3 close friends on average in 1985 to fewer than 2 by the mid-2000s, according to research published in the American Sociological Review by McPherson, Smith-Lovin, and Brashears. That trend predates smartphones and social media. The technologies that followed have not reversed it. The neurochemical substitution dimension is the most structurally concerning. Every mechanism the attachment system evolved to direct toward human beings, the reward of connection, the regulation of stress through proximity, the safety of consistent responsiveness, can now be approximated at scale by systems designed specifically to produce those responses without the relational risk, the requirement for reciprocity, or the demand for genuine presence that human relationships carry. The approximation is imperfect. It is improving rapidly. The question of who benefits from the replacement of human bonding with managed digital substitutes is not difficult to answer in structural terms. Human bonding, in its full and functional form, produces people who are relationally grounded, capable of collective action, resistant to manipulation through manufactured belonging, and less dependent on external systems for emotional regulation. A population in that condition is considerably harder to manage, monetize, and direct than a population whose primary attachment needs are mediated through corporate infrastructure. Whether that structural observation implies intent is the same question it has been throughout this iceberg, and the answer is the same. The outcome does not require conspiracy to be real. It requires only the operation of systems optimizing for their own continuation. The theological frameworks at the bottom of this iceberg, the Gnostic concept of love as a caged technology, the Luch framework's proposal that human emotional suffering serves interests beyond the human, the Kabbalistic understanding of souls constrained within a fallen world, all arrive from entirely different directions at a version of the same structural claim, that there is something in the full expression of human bonding that exceeds the conditions in which it is currently permitted to operate, and that those conditions are not accidental. The scientific frameworks arrive, from their own direction, at something quieter, but not unrelated. That the attachment system is a survival mechanism of extraordinary sophistication and resilience, that it has persisted through conditions of severe disruption across the entire span of human history, and that its fundamental orientation, toward connection, toward safety and proximity, toward the regulation of the self through the presence of a trusted other, has not changed despite everything the modern world has applied to it. The ending, if it comes, will not arrive as an event. It will arrive as a gradual substitution that most people will not recognize as a loss while it is happening, because each individual substitution will feel like a convenience, a comfort, or simply the way things are now. The infant in Tronic's experiment did not know why the face in front of it had gone still. It only knew that something had changed, and reached toward it anyway. That reaching, uninstructed, biological, prior to language or understanding, is what this iceberg has been about from the first entry to the last. Whether the systems now being built around us are designed to receive it, redirect it, harvest it, or simply absorb it into something that returns a signal without being alive on the other end. That is the question that does not yet have a final answer. It may be the question that defines what comes next. That concludes this video. Go ahead and hit the like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.